We have quorum. I'm going to call the meeting to order. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. Other individuals and the media may also audibly and or visually recording this meeting. As well, a reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. First on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. Madam Clerk, are there any changes to this morning's agenda?
No, Mr. Deputy Mayor, there are no changes.
I need a motion then to move and second the agenda as presented. Moved by Pearson, seconded by Johnson. All those in favor? It's an electronic vote. Okay, thank you. We now need an approval of the minutes from our previous meetings of January the 30th and January the 31st. So first on is 3.1, moved by Whitehead, seconded by Partridge. All those in favor? That's an electronic vote. Nice try. Thank you. And 3.2 is the January 31st minutes. All in favor? Again, electronic vote. Thank you very much. We have two presentations, I believe, today. 6.1, Brian, you're going to help us with the 2019 Operating Budget Council referred items. And I believe everyone has the presentation in front of you.
Good morning. Good morning. Speaking. Yeah, tell me if I need to be in front of the microphone. Today we have two items on the agenda. Item 6.1, the council referred items, and item 6.2, the business cases, or what we previously referred to as budget enhancements, and those have been put together by staff. So the council referred items we're going to go through first, and then I'll switch the presentations. We're going to have staff available from the departments and divisions to answer some specific questions about the council referred items and the business cases. So this is similar to our process that we would have done in the past, whereas the GM or the acting GM would sort of lead and introduce the topic, introduce the specific council referred item or the business case, and then the department would go through the specifics about it. So you've received Appendix A to Book 1. So the business cases and the council referred items are in that document that was handed out, and so anybody who's going to go electronic, that information is available on our website as well. So those books have more of the detail. I don't know if I think we referenced it in the email that we sent out that was there. So there'll be more detail in there, but the relevant staff will be available to answer questions. So what I'm going to do first is the intention of this meeting is similar to, we've had budget presentations from all of the departments and then the corporate financials and non-program revenues. So decisions don't necessarily have to be made today on the council referred items and the business cases. It's to get information similar to information you received on the departmental budget presentation. So you get information, and then we have subsequent meetings that are in the calendar, and I'll go through those in a second. So just to start it off, so where we are right now. So information that we presented on December the 7th. At GIC, Mike presented where we are, and this was also in your budget books. So where we stand right now is at 3.2% tax increase. We build in some assumptions in there about growth and reassessment, and we'll mention before that we have more information coming on that on March 1st. And as we finalize information in the next few weeks, we may be able to update GIC during the budget meetings about the assessment impact. So that's where we stand right now, and that's an average impact, residential impact of $111. And these numbers don't include the council referred items and the business cases that we're going to get to in a minute. So remaining process dates. So today, February 8th, the council referred items and the business cases. On Monday, the public delegations will be coming at from 3 o'clock on. Stephanie's shaking her head. Yeah, so it's from 3 o'clock on. They'll come in. They'll have now seen information that we've presented that's on our website on all of the budgets for the past few months, and then they'll be asking questions of council. Subsequent dates: February 15th, February 25th, February 28th, March 1st, and then council has been set for March 27th. On the February 15th date right now, next Friday, what we have is we typically bring a budget recommendation report. So what that basically says is that you have received presentations on all of the budgets. Here's the departmental levy impact. Here's the corporate financials and non-program revenue impact. And any amendments that might have been made for some of the boards and agencies, we would have that presented next week. And we have an amendment schedule that we attach with that. So that'll be on the agenda now. Now it's up for deliberation over the next few weeks. Also coming, we have advisory committees. So their budgets will be coming to that meeting next week as well. And the operating impacts of capital, we talked about them last week, so they'll be coming back on February the 15th. And any discussions that happen today, if we start having more discussions on February 15th on the council referred items and the business cases. So right now, February 25th, 28th, and March 1st are open. Nothing scheduled until we have actual items that are requested that you ask for additional information. At General Issuance Committee the other day, there was a question about minimum wage and living wage. So that was a normal GIC, a regular GIC. So that'll go to council and then be referred to the budget process, and we'll bring that report. I can't remember if we suggested a date. So that information will come back during this budget cycle between so either February 25th or February 28th likely. And the other issue that we had was the planning fees, right? So that we discussed that a few times. I know Councillor Clark was interested in that about the process. So there's a special meeting set up on March 22nd. So special GIC where there's I guess public consultation is taking place as well. So there's an opportunity for delegates to delegate on the fees, and then that decision from that committee meeting will go to council on March 27th as well. So during the next few weeks, we have a decision if we would like to put in some kind of an estimate of what the additional revenues can go into the 2019 budget. So we can do that the next few weeks, maybe possibly add something into the 2019 budget. And then if something different happens at the March 22nd meeting, then we can make an adjustment. So that'll be open for discussion in the next few meetings.
Can we wait till the end of the, okay, thank you.
So council referred items. So we have 6 items that were referred basically during the last term of council. And one of them is in the city manager's office, and the other ones are in planning and economic development. And we have details on them in the next few pages. So like I mentioned earlier, so these numbers are not included in the budget numbers that I presented earlier, the 3.2%. So the impact of these is 0.03% of a tax increase. It's an additional 1.5 FTEs, and we'll get into these in a minute. So since the budget book was produced, though, one of the items that was added in that total was Hess Village paid duty policing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the cannabis enforcement team that was added at a special GIC in January. So those weren't in the budget book. We produced the budget books in December, so this information got added later. So just checking with Stephanie. So the cannabis enforcement one, that business case was attached to your agenda. So what we've done in the past, just turn it on. Yeah. Well, so what we've done in the past is that I can introduce them, and then each of the general managers or the relevant director or manager can go through the specifics. So we have them here. So like we're going to go through planning and economic development first. So there's 5 of them. And so those 2 that I mentioned that we've highlighted there as being post-budget book. So those are there for the licensing and bylaws, the cannabis one. And then the last one in order, we're having planning and economic development go first, and then the city manager's office. So we'll go through these, and then the idea being is that you're asking questions about them. You have a lot of detail in your books, and the general manager and staff can go through the specifics about them. So when you see the gross cost, this is the gross 2019 cost, and the net 2019 cost. So whenever there is a 0, there is a funding source. So whether that is revenues or from users or provincial subsidies, that's why the net would be 0. And we've indicated if there's any full-time equivalents required in these business cases, or in these council referred items. So there were specific reports that were written in previous term of council that we have reference to, and we can talk to those as well if you need to. So what I will do is I'll sit down over there, and then then I'll come back up for item 6.2 to just sort of start the presentation again. But this is item 6.1, and if that's okay, and then we'll go through the minutes. Well, there's no further slides. Just a thank you. So everything's in front of you as far as that particular slide, and now we'll go through them individually.
Thanks, Brian. I'll wait till you get to your seat. And just to be clear, did you want to start at the city manager's office enhancement, or are we starting on the planning ones first? Okay, let's do that. I have 2 speakers first, or I have 1. Councillor Farr.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'll get off to a great start here this Friday morning and look at CR02. Our overall net for planning is going to be reduced from 196,240 to 166,240, as I have been consulting with our General Manager of Planning and Economic Development on the cigarette butt bylaw enforcement officer, and as it relates to this council referred item, really wouldn't be able to get going for a number of months anyway, 6 months or so. While it is $30K and there are other monetary deliberations to be had on this particular file, it is also half of an FTE, so not only would we reduce with the deferral to the 2020 on council referred, we would also reduce the FTEs that we're looking at today for planning at 1.5 to 1.0. So right out of the gates,
So you're asking then to remove that from the list?
add to the 2020 budget on council referred, and if I could, through you, have Jason Thorne sort of explain this further, or Kelly, or both.
Jason?
Yeah, so through the chair, this was an item that was referred to this budget process, which would be a proactive enforcement officer to deal with cigarette butt bylaw, which would be implemented after a period of time of having an education program that would be initiated through Public Works. So that the general sense was it would be around 9 months after the education program had been in force, and that the enforcement through the officer would begin. So that education campaign has not yet begun. It is close to being finalized right now, and so as the councillor said, I would not anticipate that this officer would be needed until the 2020 budget process. So there's no issue with having it referred to 2020. After that education campaign has happened, we can report back to council in terms of the results of that education campaign, and then council can consider at the time of the 2020 budget if you want to do the enforcement as well with the additional officer.
As you're aware, being a member, former member of the Downtown Safety and Security Task Force, where this concept originated and ultimately at the council floor, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we're going to have a new board soon. We haven't met yet. So in all likelihood, there'll be a good discussion around this. There'll be a historic review, and then possibly some tweaks on particularly the educational component. And so, to be fair and to allow that new makeup an opportunity to debate this, I think that also opens the door. This would also open the door for that in the coming months. So Much appreciated. Thank you, Jason, and thank you to Kelly as well.
Okay, so let's do that now since you've raised it. You're moving then to take that off the list as an enhancement and to refer it to the 2020 budget process. Seconder for that one, Councillor Marula. Councillor Johnson, I had you on the list, so you're not on this issue. Okay, so on the motion that's been presented, all those in favor, Madam Clerk, electronic vote? Yep. Carries, thank you. So let's go through them from the top. First one is the zoning examiner enforcement officer. Jason, you want to walk us through that one and give us a refresher again?
Sure. So through the chair, this was an item, this, I guess for benefit of the new members of council, dates back to around 2016, I guess, is when there was a couple of delegations coming forward that were specifically identifying concerns with a number of illegal businesses operating in the rural area of Ward 11. Range of types of uses that were operating illegally on rural properties, outdoor storage, those types of uses. At the time, we had a significant backlog in terms of the complaints and staff's ability to proactively go through and address all of those complaints. So in March of 2017, council approved a pilot project, an 18-month pilot project where we had a full-time officer just dedicated to dealing with those illegal businesses in the rural area. This was sort of some unique skills required in this officer. I would say some unique skills in terms of working in the rural area. I think requires a specific particular approach, and also understanding the rural zoning issues. So we had that officer in place. We reported back at approximately 6-month intervals to council in terms of the enforcement activities. During the pilot project, we had, so we were dealing with a backlog of over 70 complaints at that time. We worked through that. We had nearly 200 inspections, site visits. Most of it resulted in voluntary compliance. There were a couple of orders and legal actions that were taken with respect to those illegal businesses. We reported back in August of last year at the closure of that pilot project. We indicated the number of enforcement actions that had been taken. And had indicated that, in our view, it had been an effective pilot project. And after staff had reported back on the closure of the pilot project, it was at that time that council made the motion to refer it to this budget, to the 2019 budget, for consideration as a permanent project. So as a permanent officer dedicated to addressing illegal businesses in the rural area. So the pilot project was extended to this point in time in that August report. And so the officer has continued to be doing both reactive and proactive enforcement in the rural area since that time. And so that's the enhancement that is before you today as to whether to continue that as a dedicated officer focused in that area. Without the enhancement, then we would simply assign that to our regular group of officers who would deal with it consistent with any other area of the city.
Councillor Johnson.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I so appreciated the fact that my colleagues supported this in the last term. It was my understanding, however, now that this zoning and examination officer is going to be citywide. It's not just going to be in one particular ward. Because my understanding is that even though it was a pilot project to be held in just one ward, her position ended up spreading out because everyone was coming to her from different wards, and she was actually doing the work in other wards as well. So can you just clarify for me, because I'm willing to move this, because my understanding was now that it's opened up for the entire city because the demand is so great.
Yes, through the chair. So we have done some complaint-driven enforcement in other parts of the city, in other rural areas outside of Ward 11. The original direction of the pilot project was that the proactive enforcement would just be in Ward 11, but we would deal reactively in other rural wards. So certainly if this is a permanent officer, that she would be able to deal with both proactive and reactive in any part of the rural area, if that's the direction that council wishes to give.
So it's just simply for the rural area. Do you mind, sir, if I can ask Ken to come down to the, because this is his direct department. Good morning, Ken, thanks.
Morning, I apologize, I was dealing with another issue.
Another illegal business, okay. So Ken, just to be clear here, it was a very successful pilot project in specifically my ward, but my understanding is that this officer has now been working in other wards, that it's now becoming a wider venue, so it's not going to be specifically to one ward anymore.
Through the chair, that is correct. Very successful in your ward, found lots of illegal businesses, found lots of stolen property, illegal chop shops, a lot of work done in that area. But this officer, in the report she gave me yesterday, also found 9 additional illegal businesses in other rural wards as well. So she's become very talented in helping the other officers as well, coaching them on zoning, because zoning, of course, is extremely complicated to bring a case to court.
Thank you for that, and I'm just a little bit confused, because it was my understanding was that she was actually working in all 15 wards and not just specifically rural wards because of her expertise in the zoning area.
Through the chair, that is correct. I mean, the original pilot was for your ward, and we wanted to make sure that we are dealing with that. But because of her expertise and other zoning complaints from other officers, she has been there supporting them, helping them resolve some of the issues.
So bottom line is that this officer is not going to be particularly into one specific ward. She's actually an enhancement for the rest of the staff to do their jobs of their illegal businesses, because she has the background of the zoning expertise. So I'm happy to move this going forward. Just from my own perspective and what's happened in my ward, my residents are absolutely thrilled now, because they're not waking up to beeping sounds and loudspeakers telling people line 1's for them when they're not even zoned to be there. So it's been a really good, and it's been a positive thing in that respect as well, because the businesses that moved out there, quite frankly, some of them just didn't know. So getting them into compliance, getting them into where they need to be instead of where they shouldn't be, has been happy all around. We've had a few disgruntled businesses, but overall, it's been a very positive exercise, and I totally support this to go citywide, not just one particular ward. So I'll leave it with you, and I'm happy to move it at the appropriate time.
All right. Councillor Clark.
So is the sole responsibility for this individual just going to be looking at illegal businesses?
Through the chair, yes. She's become our zoning expert, although, and has helped coach the other ones, but her focus has been on illegal businesses in the rural wards.
And so what do we have in terms of staff dealing with illegal fill operations that are happening in our rural area? I've been speaking with Mr. Thorne. We've got 1 or 2 in our area. One we dealt with relatively quickly. The other one's become a real problem. So how are we doing that type of enforcement? Because it's pretty much flaunting our permit process and our bylaws.
Through the chair, there's another division that looks after a lot of the illegal fills and permits, but we are there to support them as far as mud tracking and garbage and debris. And so we do work closely with the other department that deals with illegal fills.
And is that division in your division or another division in the city?
Through the chair, that's in the Growth Management Division. So that's the group that deals with enforcement of that bylaw and also like construction management plans, things of that nature. So that's done through the Growth Management Division in Planning Economic Development. If the problem they identify as a result of fill operation is, as Ken said, garbage and debris or mud tracking, those sorts of things which become property standards issues, then they're referred to Ken's officers for enforcement.
Okay, thank you. I'll raise other questions later on.
Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So, Ken, I understood when this was originally brought in, and I'm very happy to support the councillor for the area. Lord knows she had a number of issues going on, and you know, as a result, this pilot was brought forward. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
And at the time, I remember my council colleague at the time, Councillor Pasuta, and I asked the question. This was going to remain for Ward 11 only, and it would not affect Flamborough businesses. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. And yet now I'm hearing that it is going to affect all the rural areas across the city. Is that correct?
Through the chair, the original pilot was for a proactive enforcement in Ward 11. However, we do receive numerous complaints that are reactive, and this officer has assisted in the reactive enforcement, assisting other officers as well, but not proactively as we did in Ward 11.
Okay, thank you. So these are proactive investigations up to this point, but going forward, they're not necessarily going to be proactive. They will be, but they'll also be as a result of complaints. So it'll be a two-prong approach. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Chair, I also have a couple of questions for Jason Thorne. So my concern is that there's been a number of zoning changes. And my question to you, Jason, is are there businesses that have been operating for 30, 40, 50 years that are now could possibly now be deemed illegal because of zoning changes?
So through the chair, two parts to that. One is if the business was originally legally established, then despite any change in the zoning, they would continue to be legal as a legal non-conforming use. So that is if they were legally established and then the zoning changes at some point in the future to no longer permit that use, they are considered to be still legal operating uses. That's part of the response. The other is that at the time of the rural zoning bylaw, there was actually a process in place where a number of businesses could have come forward for a grandfathering. And that was done, and I apologize, I can't remember the number of businesses, but it was a fair number that came forward at that time prior to the adoption of the rural zoning bylaw to have their uses grandfathered in. So again, if that was the case, they'd be able to continue on as a legal non-conforming. If they had been illegally established prior to the rural zoning bylaw, they would just remain illegal after the rural zoning bylaw.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I appreciate it. The concern and, you know, that whole grandfathering and setting up that registry, it was mostly directed, in fact, I think it was 100% directed at rural landscapers. And out of 200 and some odd in Flamborough, 160, I think, in Flamborough, about 80 came forward and registered, and mainly because these folks had been challenged in the past with you know, being harassed, and they felt harassed by bylaw when, you know, they had been operating in many cases for years. And so this is where I'm going with this, is that's my big concern, is the number of businesses that I've been involved in over the past 8 years that have been, you know, operating for years, and now somebody either makes a complaint or doesn't make a complaint, but there's a proactive investigation, or they want to expand their business, or they want to create a duplex legally, and the duplex has been there for 40 years. Now they want to, you know, have it go through the proper channels, and it just isn't going to happen. And there are just so many challenges around that. I don't know if other councillors experience that in their wards. I do know that Ward 11 has had significant problems, and I've been very, very happy to support the councillor. But I can't support this going citywide. In citywide, it would be in the rural areas, because Flamborough would be so, could be so detrimentally affected by it. So I'm very, very concerned about that, and I'm not sure if you can offer a solution of any kind, but I'd certainly be willing to hear it.
Through the chair, I can begin, and then Ken can follow up. We do, as we do with any of our bylaws, we have in some cases, council has asked for proactive enforcement. In some cases, we just do reactive enforcement based on complaints from the community. And Ken will typically bring that forward to council every couple of years in terms of the prioritization of our enforcement activities. So there is the option to be proactive in some areas, and in other areas be reactive and complaints driven. If that's the way that council wishes to proceed with this particular enforcement action, then we can take that as direction to staff in terms of how to proceed. If it's reactive in certain parts of the city, we obviously can't control if there's a lot of complaints that get generated or no complaints that get generated. For the most part, most of our bylaws is more of a reactive, and where council has directed particular concerns, as they did in Ward 11 with the illegal businesses, then we go out and do proactive enforcement.
And you know, thank you. And Chair, I would certainly like to have that direction for Flamborough. Most definitely that it not be proactive, that it be reactive. If someone makes a complaint, absolutely it should be investigated. But In terms of proactive, I'm not on side for that. I'll look forward to hearing from Ken.
And through the chair, just so you know, certainly in our division, we're all about compliance. And so enforcement is only used at the very end. And the success of the Ward 11 pilot project has been working hand in hand with the business owners to help them become compliant. And so helping them through the system, helping them through planning and getting their licenses. And so not a heavy hand approach, but certainly that's been the success, I believe, of this pilot project. And this zoning officer is working very closely with the individual and the corporation and the companies to become compliant so that, that we resolve the complaint.
Thank you for that. Those are my concerns, and if staff will take the direction to not be proactive within the Flamborough community, well, certainly Ward 15, I can't speak for the other councillors. I'll let them certainly speak for themselves. But, oh, yes, I can? Okay, thank you. Yes, so apparently I can. But those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Whitehead, you're next.
Thank you, and I absolutely supported, because it was pretty clear through the presentation that there was an issue, it was a bubble, it was an activity issue in a particular area of the ward. You didn't hear this from anywhere else but the ward. This council recognized it and supported the additional staff to address that issue, to bring it to a level of stability, which sounds like you've done now. I'm a bit concerned that, well, I guess the first question, is there cost recovery in this position?
Through the chair, that seems to be the difficult issue, because obviously if a business is not paying business taxes, then of course, once they become compliant, they will be paying business taxes, but to actually calculate that's a little difficult, as you know, we have a 4-year cycle for that to happen. But we do believe that there are businesses that are operating that were not paying corporate taxes, and now they are. And so there is a recovery to the city. To quantify that, it's more difficult. I know there has been charges, and of course then there's fines that come from that. But to actually qualitative numbers of is it full cost recovery, I cannot tell you that, and I do not believe it is.
Okay, and I guess the concern I have is that is it the opinion of staff that this is an ever-growing issue in ward, the particular ward that we identified this bylaw officer for, or this was a historic legacy issue within the ward that you've now gone in and addressed?
Through the chair, over the period of the year, we've done 95 complaints, 240 investigations. We believe there's still lots of work to be done, but I think we are slowly getting a handle on it. But again, as you know, how businesses are, if you don't check them and you don't hold people accountable and make sure that they're following the zoning, that they'll just open up again. And I think we spent a great deal of time with the councillor to resolve these issues, and we think we have a handle on it, but I think it continues to need to have enforcement and focus on this.
So could I ask then, is there a way that we can determine whether these were legacy problems that came to a head that and required the additional staff, or is this an ongoing issue at the same level that justifies the expenditure for the ward?
Through the chair, I would think the councillor probably has a best handle on that issue.
I'm looking for empirical data. I'm looking, I mean, the reality is we're going to justify things, we need to have measurements and metrics. And anecdotal information is just that, but we need to carve into the metrics.
Through the chair, please.
So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for an activity-based reporting as well. I'm looking at any revenue that was generated through fines. And the other question I have is scope creep. So when this council provides direction, absolute clear direction on what the program was for, and you go beyond the scope of that direction, where's that latitude? Help me understand, because I'm just concerned that when we identify a particular programs and projects, and then there's unilateralism of exercising that resource outside of that scope of that direction, It might work in this case, but it concerns me that there's no checks and balances, and especially after recent conversations, I want to make sure there's checks and balances.
Through the chair, to explain, the pilot project was focused on Ward 11, and it stayed in Ward 11. When I talk about 9 other investigations in other wards, those would be reactive. So other officers would have had them and gone to ask this officer, who's developed significant expertise in shepherding these businesses to become legal, to assist them. So this officer has become, as I say, probably an expert in municipal law enforcement for zoning and has actually helped them. So there was no scope creep. The focus for the pilot continued on the pilot. And as far as statistics, we did bring an interim report which had significant statistics. And I have the full statistics of what this officer has done and was, in our opinion, very successful.
So am I hearing then, through the chair, that prior to the hiring of this individual, we didn't have the expertise within our significant bylaw division?
Through the chair, we had officers that were tied into zoning, but as indicated before, these zoning investigations take significant amount of time. And so you could find a business, you could see that they weren't operating, you could actually just give them a fine and take them to court. But what this officer did was to help them become compliant. So had the focus on ensuring that the businesses were identified, work with them so that they, of course, dealt with, got properly zoned, and then, of course, obtained their business license if need be. So it was more of a better customer service focus approach on this to ensure that the businesses in Ward 11 were compliant with the law.
So I really appreciate the approach, but again, it begs the question, does that suggest we don't do that anywhere else? Through the chair.
Through the chair, this project was brought forward because there was significant amounts of work in Ward 11, and so although we had expertise, the amount of work required, we didn't have the staff to do it.
Okay, so, but now we're sort of going in a circle, Mr. Chair. I've been told that this particular individual who was hired for a specific purpose in a specific area, who did proactive and worked with, which is great, by the way, worked with the businesses, was the prime role and the purpose of the pilot program. And at some point, this individual ended up servicing 15 wards, even though that wasn't the direction of the pilot program.
Through the chair, for clarity, the other wards had investigations by other officers that were reactive, not proactive, and because this person had expertise in developing the approach in Ward 11, she became the assistant of the other officers so that they could use the same approach. So never went outside the scope, but became the expert to assist municipal law enforcement to make sure these businesses were in compliance.
So could I have somebody read me the actual motion? Because I'm not sure exactly what the scope is anymore. You're indicating that because it didn't address reactive, you had the scope to go beyond the direction of that particular motion. So can somebody just read me the direction? Remind me of that, what that direction was?
In terms of in terms of ongoing roles and responsibilities of this individual?
Yeah, what the original direction was that was provided for this individual.
Okay, I think it was responding to illegal business activities, specifically in Ward 11, right? Proactively, not reactive.
That's what, I just want to hear the wording.
Okay. Do we have that information from the archives? We'll have to get back to you, Councillor.
Okay.
I think you've heard today, though, to be fair, what the go-forward position is in terms of what this person will do.
Again, Mr. Chair, I have no problem with what's being suggested, but in light of a very topical issue, it really is about understanding and refining and sticking to the directions that are provided by this council. And I'm concerned that at least it appears on the face that we've got scope creep. This went beyond the direction, and if that's the case, then at least it needs to be identified. doesn't affect where we're going on a go-forward basis, but I just want to make sure that there's an understanding from staff, when direction is given and is specific, that they stick within that, within those parameters, and when you go beyond those parameters, it concerns me, because
Today, just to be clear, today's discussion is to either include
Keep it.
this in the budget or not. In terms of the roles and responsibilities, I think you heard from some questions from Councillor Partridge, that it's still an open discussion in terms of how this individual, if they're still working for us or this position is still here.
Well, here's the question then. If we select to keep it in the budget for now, there's still a window to address that when I get further information from staff. Is that correct?
Yeah, so through the chair, that's correct.
And that's perfect. I'm fine with that. Thank you.
That's great. Councillor Ferguson, you're a first-time speaker.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my biggest concern with this was the same as it was with the living wage motion, is that it's putting the budget in the wrong direction. You know, I'm terrified of where we're at already at 3.2%. Sorry, Brian, but every time we have another motion, it's sending it further north. And we have a duty to get this south, a fiduciary duty. So that's my big concern with any of these enhancements, and I'll probably take the same position on not all of them. On this matter in general, I don't really have, I'm like Councillor Partridge, I don't really have a problem with the legal businesses of Ward 12, except one, and that's a cannabis grow operation that went ahead without zoning, without a building permit, put up a 13,000 square meter facility. And on that one, my perception is the staff are helping them. And so we're going to hire a person to shut them down, but we got this illegal one going on. And, you know, they come in with a potted mum suggestion, knowing just till they could try to get through an appeal, taking a huge risk, when they had no intention of growing potted mum. So I'm not sure what advantage this will do to Ward 12. We did have a significant advantage, 3 years ago with landscapers, but we dealt with that matter, and that's behind us. So apart from that problem, we seem to be in pretty good shape now. I'm just not on to send the budget north, though. I have trouble with that. So question to you, if I can, to Jason. Jason, you're asking for a 2.7% increase on your budget. You're suggesting a 100% increase in fees, which is a discussion for another day. I did get a copy of the reserve report from staff, and I tried to print it out, but the printer won't print those pages. It prints different one, but it seems to me you have something in the order of $30 million in planning and economic development reserves. Can you not fund this through one of those?
So through the chair, no. So the planning fee increases can only be used for the purposes of administering the development approvals process. It can't be used for any other purpose. And the reserves you mentioned, I think the lion's share of those reserves would be the development fee stabilization reserve, which again is fee-generated dollars, which can only be used for administering development approvals, and the building enterprise reserve, which again is building permit fees that can only be used for the purposes of administering the building permit process under the Ontario Building Code. So those are restricted reserves that can only be used for those purposes.
Okay, so the answer is always the same, come back to the taxpayers for more then. And that's what I'm having trouble with, Mr. Chairman. And not just with planning and economic development. You know, this is hiring another staff person. According to my count, we're already in the order of 70 new staff with this budget. I recall that there's 25 in police, 30 in transit, and 10 in paramedics, and there's some other miscellaneous ones scattered out there. And is this really where we want to go? And I know I get it. I'm standing alone on this. I can see the votes and I see where it's going, but it's really troubling me. And maybe that's because of my background. You know, in the private sector, you had to have a relentless quest for cost reduction every day. And I just see this going the other way, and it's like fingers on a chalkboard to me. But I recognize I'm only one vote of 16 around this table, but I'm going to keep harping at the same thing. And just on Councillor Clark asked a very good question, because illegal dumping is a major problem in our rural areas. You know, Waterdown Gardens is a horrible mess. I've had, I think, 5 meetings since I've taken over that area in my ward, and we are making some progress just to bring everyone up to speed. We've had a meeting last week with the Ministry of Environment there, with the police there, with development engineering, and some neighbors in the community, some leaders in the community around the neighborhood. And we found a Halton Hills bylaw that requires a permit to do fill. Right now, it's reactive. Somebody calls and complains, we go check it out. What I intend to do is bring to council sooner than later a bylaw modeling after Halton Hills where you require a permit and with certain criteria have to be met, because we don't want to stop farmers from fixing problems in low areas where they can't get crops harvested. But we don't want 300,000 meters or 600 trucks a day pulling into one farm and destroying that farm in our green belt. So I will be coming back to council sooner than later with the draft bylaw. We have that bylaw, and it's off to legal now to help compose it. And I'm having a meeting next week with legal and development engineering to try to move that project along. So I thought I'd give you that update also. And so those are my issues. So I just have trouble continuing every day to send the budget north. I know it's the first year of a 4-year term. That's probably weighing heavy in everybody's mind. This is the time to do it. But when you start running at almost double what the inflation rate is, I'm uncomfortable with it. But that's just my own personal feelings. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson for a second time.
Yeah, thank you, and I really wanted to help clarify a few things, just to for the record. When we came up with this idea and we had this officer go out there, most of the businesses that were on this list, that were identified, we found out from the majority of the people who said, I moved out here so I could avoid paying the taxes. And they moved from Haldimand County. They moved from West Lincoln. They weren't just within our own city. They came into our city because they felt it was an easy pick, that they didn't have to pay the taxes. So now if they come into compliance and now they're paying the proper taxes, there's your cost recovery rate there. So that's it in a nutshell for me. We realized when this officer came on board that there was a huge gap in the department, because we had people going out there helping businesses become compliant, but didn't have the expertise with the zoning, et cetera. And she filled those gaps. And that made it very, very clear to us just how valuable she was for Ken's department. And folks, they're illegal. It's the bottom line. They're illegal. So why is it that we're looking at maybe spending $30,000 for somebody who has absolutely no enforceable properties, telling people to pick up their cigarette butts, but we're having blatant, in-your-face, illegal businesses taking up agricultural lands that are supposed to be protected, and we're saying we don't want it. We don't want that to happen. And just to clarify, too, that it was in a proactive way in my ward, but reactive in other wards. Because I can tell you right now, the minute that a bylaw officer, and you all know this in your own wards, they come into one of your residents, you'd have an illegal balcony. Well, so does he. And then the list becomes longer. So that's the other issue as well. So when you have these businesses out there, somebody rats out somebody else, then it becomes this chain of events, no matter whether we have this officer on board or not. But this officer being on board has saved us staff time, court costs, and lots of money at the end of the day, in my humble opinion. So landscapers in Flamborough, that was resolved. They're legal. That's not an issue. One of the things we did find, though, was that when somebody said, well, what about Joe Blow down the road? Joe Blow's been there for 50 years. We did not capture Joe Blow in the last bylaw. So what we needed to do was to bring a motion forward to recognize this business has been in effect for 50 years, and we did not include them in the new bylaw, so it helped us to do a lot of good housekeeping. So just to put everyone's minds at ease, trust me, there's enough work in Ward 11 to keep this person going for a while. The rest would be reactive, and trust me again, that's filled up her plate beyond belief, because I found she was doing less work in our ward because she was doing some of the reactive work for helping the other officers get things done quicker, more cost-effective, no court cases, it just got done properly. So this was a gap in the staffing that needs to be filled. I'm 100% behind it. I totally understand my colleagues' concerns that it's making things go this way. But in actual fact, if you look at the cost effectiveness of this job, it's actually making the rest of the staff time become more productive. So those are my thoughts, and I hope that we get the support going forward.
Councillor Clark for a second time.
I'm still giggling about Joe Blow, because he's just a big bag of wind anyways. Joe Blow is just a bag of wind anyways. Oh, okay. I want to thank Councillor Ferguson for working on that bylaw. I'd be happy to assist in any way I can. It's become a huge issue in the area that I'm now representing. Has like an 85% increase in land mass, and it's all rural. So we're finding that they're coming here. So with regards to the zoning examiner enforcement officer, are there policies in place that, that indicate to such a person that they don't jump to enforcement right away, that they begin by doing, seeking compliance over a period of time? Here's the things that you need to come into compliance with. As long as the property owner is working in that direction and with that time frame, then we avoid charges, and as soon as they refuse to participate anymore, then the gloves come off and enforcement starts. Do we have something written in policy that way so that everyone is treated the same?
Through the chair, we do. We have a progressive enforcement policy that we've implemented a couple years ago, and we use it in licensing as well as zoning or all license enforcement. Our focus has always been about compliance, and we certainly know that we have better luck helping people become compliant. They have a better attitude towards the city and feel much better when we're holding their hands to help them become compliant rather than coming after them with a hammer.
And that helps me a great deal, because that means the policy's there and everyone across the city is going to be dealt with in the exact same equal, reasonable, and fair manner. So I'm struggling because I'm hearing some of my colleagues argue that they don't want this type of enforcement compliance in their ward. And yet, last week in planning, Mr. Thorne came forward with a report to us of a letter that they sent to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing about Bill 66. And the major crux of the argument and concern was that it creates inequities between, that could create inequities between municipalities, where some municipalities, in essence, would be incentivizing bad planning, while Hamilton is enforcing good planning, and then we are now at a competitive disadvantage because Haldeman, I'm using them only as an example, looks the other way on these issues and issues these bylaws for open business. That was a major crux of our concern, was it not, to Mr. Thorne?
Through the chair, yes, it was.
So what's the difference here? I'm just struggling. What's the difference here? How can we argue that on one stand, but on another stand, we're arguing that across the city, different wards should be treated differently when it comes to municipal bylaw enforcement? Doesn't that in itself create an incentive for certain businesses to go to one specific ward? Because in Clark's ward, they're going to enforce, whereas in another ward, they're not going to?
So through the chair, I don't think it's a question of enforcing or not enforcing. It's a question of, are we being proactive or reactive? And I can say the same differentiation exists in other bylaws. For example, on property standards, we always do a proactive blitz in around Mohawk, McMaster during move-in and move-out dates, because those have just historically been problem areas that generate a lot of concerns. So if a complaint comes in, if an illegal business is brought to our attention, then it is the same rules that apply regardless of where you are in the city. I think the question that's really before council is, if you were to approve this additional officer, are we directing this officer to the officer would be reacting across citywide if there are complaints that come in citywide. If an illegal business has gotten to the point where it's causing a nuisance or concerns with the neighbors that generates a complaint, this officer would react to those complaints the same across the city. The question is, if council identifies a certain area that is particularly problematic and wants to address proactive enforcement in that area, then that is consistent with directions that have been provided in other areas of bylaw as well.
This zoning examiner enforcement officer will represent the entire city, and we have policies in place in terms of how they're supposed to act. So respectfully, we're kind of parsing words whether or not it's reactive or proactive. If the policy is in place and all wards are being treated equally, all businesses are being treated equally, fairly, and reasonably, then one business in another area can't argue I'm being penalized when another business in another area is not being dealt with.
Yeah, so through the chair, the progressive enforcement policy that Ken is speaking about is the consistent policy that all officers use when they are enforcing an illegal business. So the question is just about whether or not the officer is only reacting to complaints or is proactively looking for illegal businesses. That's how the illegal business comes to our attention. Once an illegal business is brought to our attention, then regardless of where it is and regardless of whether it was complaint-based or proactive-based, then the progressive enforcement policy would apply, where we always seek compliance first.
Do we have a record through, my last question, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through Ken, I guess it would be, of increases in corporate taxes, fees, increase of tax base based on the proactive nature of the enforcement officer on the, do we have actual numbers showing that as a result, that the tax base went up this much, permit fees went up this much?
Through the chair, we do not. And part of the reason being is that once a business starts paying taxes, there's a 4-year cycle. In the midterm report, we brought forward an example of a farm that was paying farm taxes, and then they were actually a business, and what the tax changes would be, but that was strictly anecdotal.
So supplementary, why can't we get that information then? I mean, if the argument is we shouldn't add $116,000 to our budget without knowing what the upside of adding that position to the budget and increasing the tax base, increasing corporate taxes, increasing permit fees, and we get the final line to, it just seems that we have one side of the equation. So we're saying, no, don't add $116,000 because it's going to increase the levy. Yet intuitively, I'm thinking, wait a second, if they're doing their job right, they're going to deal with a number of businesses. You said 94 investigations. Surely we have the results of those investigations and what the increase in tax base is and corporate taxes. And if not, why can't we get it?
And through the chair, and I'm not an expert on taxes, but I know that once it's identified by the province, they have to change their system, and that's, I've been told it's a 4-year cycle before they're billed accordingly. I'm not an expert on it, but we can go back and look for that information and see if we can actually give you some specific in relation to the investigations that we came forward with.
Mr. Zagaric, please.
For you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we can work with Ken's group to get a list of the properties. I think the issue is there'll be a lag. They should be captured by MPAC, and we would work, taxation staff would work with MPAC to note the change in use, irrespective of zoning. MPAC approaches it with the change in use. So if it has gone from residential or farmland to commercial, they capture that proportion of the property that with a change in use. There may be a bit of a lag in terms of getting it onto the system, but we can work with Ken's group to try to estimate what the tax uplift is associated with that change.
Is it a four-year lag?
So through the chair, not a 4-year lag, so it's not subject to reassessment. MPAC, soon as it's brought to MPAC's attention, and we do this proactively in taxation as well, in parts is we use automation to try to identify properties with a change in use, and we bring it to MPAC's attention, and we look to have it captured in the next property tax roll. So it could have a 6-month lag, it could be, but soon as it's noted, it's dated back to where there's a change in use. So again, we can work with Ken's team to develop an inventory of affected properties and estimate what the annual uplift in taxes are.
And so, just as the last supplementary, is finance and taxation told as soon as the zoning has been changed and the orders are in place and everything's up to date? And so from that point on, we're now developing and know how much money is going to come in as a result of this and making sure that we're actually implementing the right tax changes?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I think Council approved an enhancement back in 2016. We have one FTE in taxation who works across departments and divisions as well as unilaterally to try to identify such properties where they have been assessed inaccurately or where there's been a change in use. So again, that information is captured through the assessment rolls, subject to when that information is shared with MPAC. So again, specific to this initiative, we can track that information, but we do have a FTE who is focused on trying to capture where the property is assessed inaccurately and should be not reassessed, but assessed properly to ensure that the city's utilizing and capturing the tax revenue it's entitled to.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, given that we don't know the actual uptake economically currently of this program, wouldn't it be prudent then to have this particular FTE paid through reserves, as Councillor Ferguson indicated, pending the report coming back showing what the actual balance is, what's happening?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, it would be an option for committee to consider extending this for 12 months and for staff to report back as part of the 2020 budget, inclusive of what the tax benefit has been of the increased enforcement.
So at the appropriate time, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'd be happy to move that motion, that it be extended for 12 months and that we actually get the financial numbers of the economic uptake as a result of the enforcement action. Thank you.
I already had a motion from Councillor Johnson, so if the two of you want to work together, okay, I'll come back to Councillor Clark then. I do have a second-time speaker in Councillor Whitehead.
Yeah, so for the record, I have the motion here, and it certainly does appear to me as scope creep. So I'm going to read it so that it's clear. That the subsection A of the 9 of Planning Report 16012 respecting illegal business and agriculture areas in Ward 11 be amended by removing the words proactively enforcing illegal businesses and inserting the words address the list of complaints alleged illegal businesses to read as follows. That the staff be directed to undertake an 18-month pilot program, including hiring a temporary zoning enforcement officer to address a list of complaints regarding alleged illegal businesses in the agriculture area of Ward 11. So, Mr. Chair, the reason I was asking those questions about scope creep, it's pretty clear in this direction what was directed. It's not about proactive, because it doesn't say proactive. In fact, we took proactive out. We said, let's address the complaints. I asked if this was a legacy issue, because clearly it was, and I felt that we needed to push extra resources out there to address those legacy issues. You've done that. And you didn't bring forward in the 2018 budget process that you needed an additional zoning officer to address these issues. So from a staffing point of view, there was nothing that came forward to the last budget go around and say we need this person. But obviously there was an issue in Ward 11 that came up, so we ended up addressing that issue through this particular pilot program. So I'm in a bit of a quandary because either staff made the case for it or they didn't. The reality is that this is pretty specific. I want to put that out there. We'll take it offline elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a motion then. Councillor Clark, you want to read that out? Seconded by Councillor Johnson, and that was for the 12-month extension to be funded from the reserve with a report back. That's my fault. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, this motion is dealing with CR 01, that the zoning examiner enforcement officer program be extended for one 12-month period with a report back on the economic uplift as a result of compliance and enforcement, and to be paid for it through reserves.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those, oh, who wants this?
Just so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and staff can work with Stephanie as the extension would exceed our complement control policy. We'll just have to have that noted in the motion.
Okay. On the motion, Councillor Whitehead.
Just a quick question. What is the scope of what is being requested now? Because is it sticking with the original scope that was, because if you don't change the scope to address the realities that, and by the way, this is not a criticism of what took place. It's just I want to be sure that we give clear direction. So scope is clear that it was only to deal with complaints in Ward 11. We're asking to go to the reserve and give time for staff to bring back the numbers. I have no problem with that, but I'm still unclear on the scope because if we need to amend this particular motion to expand the scope, then let's do it now.
Through the chair, for clarity, as we talk about proactive, we are working off the list that's supplied to us directly from the councillor. So we are following the original direction of removing things from the list, and the counselor is actually the one that's been providing us the significant list for us to do. And the scope will remain the same unless directed otherwise, because this officer will continue to do the proactive work in Ward 11, but is available with their expertise to assist the other officers that are assigned reactive complaints in other wards, in the rural wards.
So the only reason I asked that is because I heard that because of the amount of time that that particular officer was spending doing that other work, it was actually detracting from the primary goal of addressing the complaints in Ward 11. So again, my concern is are we doing what we were supposed to do? Are we doing a scope creep, meaning that you're pulling hours of this person away from the targeted area that we justified the expenditure in the first place?
And through the chair, I've been very careful in ensuring that the focus continues with Ward 11. The difference is this officer has such great expertise, can do a zoning investigation and complete it in a matter of days, where another officer might take an entire week. And so the expertise is kind of helping the entire division. But you are correct. I will make sure that I really focus on ensuring that this officer focuses in on the list as provided by the counselor, and only supplements when we're caught up in relation to assisting the other officers.
Thank you.
Councillor Vanderbeek for first time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So through you to Ken or to someone, what reserve is this coming out of? Is it the planning reserve?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the original pilot was funded, I believe, from tax stabilization reserve. So it would be a continuance as to the funding source from the tax stabilization reserve.
Thank you. So through you, Mr. Chair, again, and probably to Mike, we heard a lot about the planning reserve and how increased fees would be, there would be putting money into the planning and development reserve, and I'm not sure that I'm calling it the right thing. So why wouldn't this come out of that?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll start, and maybe Jason can expand, is what I believe staff shared with committee is that under legislation, those fees are obligatory fees and can only be applied for planning-related functions. And again, Jason would have a better appreciation as to what that definition is and whether this falls within or outside of that definition.
Yeah, so through the chair, so there's no planning and economic development departmental reserve. We do have reserves for various programs, and the significant ones that I think were referred to earlier were development fee stabilization. That's purely a reserve made up of fee payments from the development industry for applications, so that is restricted to being used for administering development review. And the second significant reserve is the building reserve, which again is a reserve that's built up from the payment of building permit fees and is restricted to being used for the purpose of administering the Ontario Building Code. The department also has the parking reserve, but again, that's parking revenues, and that's used for reinvestment back into the parking system. So we don't have a general planning reserve. We have those reserves that are generated through fees from various programs.
Thank you. So this will come out of the tax stabilization reserve. Thank you very much.
Councillor Clark you're on the motion.
So it's moved by my councillor, Brad Clark. He is my councillor. It's kind of schizophrenic almost. And seconded by Councillor Brenda Johnson, that the pilot program for the zoning examiner / enforcement officer, I put in brackets wards 11 and 9, because ward 9 used to be in 11. So if we're going to have a fair assessment, we have to include both. Be extended for one 12-month period to be funded through the tax stabilization reserves. B, that staff be directed to report back to the planning committee with respect to the economic uplift as a result of proactive enforcement. And C, that we will add language in the bottom that deals with the issue of it being outside the complement control policy.
Okay, thanks for reading that out. Councillor Whitehead for, I think, no, you're good? Okay. The motion's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, electronic vote, please. No, I know. Okay, thanks for that. Next one on the list.
2 down.
Jason?
So through the chair, I don't know if you want me to speak to number 2 and 3. As was stated earlier, the recommendation on 2 is to defer it to.
Two's been dealt with, three's a deferral, so we're good with that. We'll move on to number, well, for the purposes of staying on the list, let's go with CR for 5.
So through the chair, this is a program that has a fairly long history to it, and maybe I'll just sort of speak to the last couple of years of that history. The paid duty policing program in Hess Village goes back, I think, to around 2000, something like that, when it was first established that some of the bars in Hess Village would contribute to extra paid duty policing. That program has gone through various iterations. It was enshrined into a bylaw in 2005. We did a comprehensive review in 2009. Most recently, in 2018, we brought forward a report on that program. Historically, the City of Hamilton has, at times, provided the business share of that program. Most recently, through the Tax Fee Stabilization Reserve, the estimated share of the paid duty policing program that is owed by the businesses is $50,000. That's where that amount comes from. When we last brought forward a information report back in August of last year on that program, we made some changes to the bylaw in terms of how that $50,000 is allocated across businesses. There were some concerns at that time that some of the businesses were changing, and I would suggest, there's a bit of a loophole in the bylaw that meant that there was fewer and fewer businesses that were dividing up that $50,000. So we made some changes to the program at that point to divide the $50,000 across additional businesses. That was the report that we brought forward. At that time, and why this is a council-referred item, is that council adopted a resolution to pay that $50,000 for the year out of tax fee stabilization in 2018, and to direct to 2019 as a potential enhancement whether the city should absorb that cost on a go-forward basis. So that's why it's shown as a $50,000 net. There's no FTE implication here. I would suggest that, as we had noted in our 2018 report, there's a fair bit of administrative costs in terms of administering this program. So there would actually be an administrative savings to some extent if this program was no longer recouped through the businesses. So that's a brief overview. Ken can provide some additional information if required.
Councillor Farr.
Thank you. I was going to go to Ken, just specific to how helpful in recent years Hamilton Police Services has been in working collaboratively with you on this issue, on the prevailing issue, and also specifically to their own budget.
Through the chair, we have, I know the councillor did some significant work with the chief to reduce the numbers of officers there, in particular for the impact on the businesses. Businesses have actually changed and have moved out of other areas, and the financial impact on the businesses were significant, and so the numbers did not reflect what was needed, and I know that work was done. And then, of course, moving forward, the administrative amount of work that is tied to administering the collection of paid duties with the police department far exceeds that of the $50,000 that is charged to the workers, and that's where this motion came from.
So I want to thank you, your team, Chief Gert, Hamilton Police Services, the Hamilton Police Services Board, and especially to all of my colleagues over time who have been very supportive, very helpful, asked great questions. We've had many debates over many, many years. You'll recall, if you've been around since I've been around, that $50K is nothing compared to the money we were dealing with at the time, and primarily dealing with the issue of a extra tax, if you will, that is exclusive only to Hamilton, as it relates to paying for police in this nation for a specific service, in addition to everything else. So this has very much been an issue of economic development, an issue of fairness, an issue of safety and security, in what is an evolving, and I believe evolving in the right direction, our one and only entertainment district in the city. So I'm hopeful that today you will approve the enhancement that came post-budget book, and I'm not sure why, but I appreciate that it's here anyway, number one. And number two, also appreciate in this 50K approval net, that I am still bound and determined to get that net down to a goose egg. So I will not let go of this file. However, we're at a point right now where if we can continue to head in this direction, support the local businesses, focus on safety and security, continue to work unprecedented in this particular file, very collaboratively with our friends at Hamilton Police Services, and continue to work collaboratively as we always have with our licensing staff particularly. I'd be much appreciated if we can maintain the 50K that's here today, and I'll conclude, Mr. Deputy Mayor, with reminding everyone how this meeting began. I've already mitigated 30K, so maybe you could take that into consideration as well. Thank you.
Come back to you for a motion on that. Councillor Clark, you're next on the list.
So, because I don't have the documentation, how much actual paid duty is this $50,000 going to provide in terms of personnel?
Ken, please.
Through the chair, it is 3 officers and 1 supervisor. And that is, of course, what is paid duty. But, of course, as we've heard from the police numerous times, the horses are there, the other beat officers are there. So there's a significant amount there. And it really empowers the police to use as much resources they need. But this is what's actually paid for by the merchants, or originally was paid for by the merchants. So the work that the good counselor did with the chief was reducing it, because they had 8 at one time. And you would have 8 officers kind of standing around where there's only 200 people in Hess Village. And so that's where the complaints were coming from the businesses that seemed that the police were not adjusting their numbers. And so the work the counselor did was able to reduce the impact, and we changed the bylaws so that the pay duty continues to be 3 + 1 supervisor, and that is the minimum they put in. They also reduced the time, because it was from May 24th right to right past September, but they found out there was no work on Thursdays, and so they just moved it for Friday and Saturdays, and so that's how they reduced the numbers, which were fairly significant when the program first started, $200,000 or $300,000 down to where we are today.
And so do we know how much we're actually paying for the police services complement that is there because of their duty of care?
Through the chair, I don't actually have that number, but I know it was less than $50,000 for 2018 when the bill came in.
For all those officers and only $50,000?
Through the chair, that was for the paid duty portion. So the police department has a duty to bring officers into specific areas, but the paid duty was the ones that were actually volunteer officers that are working additional times. And
My point, Mr. Deputy Mayor, is how much people should know that, the city is funding the police services, and they're putting those resources into this Hess Village, and it's a lot more than $50,000 that we have going in there. I'm just asking if we have those numbers. Maybe we have to get it from Police Services Board, but it would be helpful to indicate, because at the end of the day, the taxpayers are paying for this, and the $50,000 doesn't equate to how much service is actually being committed to Hess Village on an ongoing basis.
Councillor Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just, in my experience over the last year is that we don't have paid duty officers to do Hess Village, so it's not really getting done with paid duty officers. The reason they're not getting paid duty is there's so many festivals during the summer. The officers would rather work those, and they sign up for them, not for Hess Village. So I guess my question would be to the ward councillor, do you really need this enhanced policing? Because it's been reported that the attendees are down significantly in Hess Village, and it may not be necessary anymore.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Ferguson. I appreciate the question. Just prior to you coming back in the room, one of the things I noted was that I continue to work very closely with this file, and that's why I think it's a very good question. I think that you can see an evolution, first of all, from the business point of view in our one and only entertainment district, that we're going more and more to a focus of restaurants and less from nightclubs. And you'll know that, I mean, you even mentioned, I think about 7 years ago, one of your daughters was a regular dancer back in the day.
No, I didn't say that.
So that, well, but she visited the village regularly. I'm going to keep it short. So we're evolving to the point where, to answer your question, there would be no need. And to point out what you rightly pointed out, to add to that, so not only do officers have a multitude of choices for paid duty, part-time policing, and that has actually helped bring the cost of paid duty down because they just didn't have paid duty officers to pay. But in addition to that, as you well know, as a recent past chair of Hamilton Police Services Board, a lot of officers looking for extra time are choosing more and more to get in a cruiser for a 12-hour shift rather than a 4-hour shift on a weekend evening. And so that also attributed to the mitigation of the cost. But I think more so our focus and our collaborative work as a council, as a community of business people in our one and only entertainment district to change the focus. I think you can all understand and appreciate Hess Village has been in the news a heck of a lot less than it has been since we have started this debate publicly. And we continue to trend in the right direction. So I believe if I can hopefully get some approval here today to continue with the 50K, within the next year, we may be in a place where that's, if not completely eliminated, we're in a position where you're right, it may not be required. And I think also to Councillor Clark's point, there are, and to Ken Leendert's point, there are a multitude, and as you know, of other policing efforts going on with Mounted and Action and Beat and other officers on regular duty in that area on a consistent basis, particularly in the season. And I hope that the patio season. I hope that answers your question.
I'm not sure it did, although I just want to point out what did actually happen with my daughter. I questioned her one night at 11:15 at night. I'm going to bed. She's blowing her hair dry. So what the heck are you doing blowing your hair dry at 11:15 at night? The answer was, I'm going to Hess. So I tuned her up a little bit then. But much as you can for a teenager. But you didn't answer my question. No. You didn't have any paid duty last year because none would sign up for it. Why do you really need $50,000 for this year?
Let's be upfront with them, Councillor, please.
What did you say?
It's budgeted. And I think staff can. It's budgeted, and therefore it may be expended, and it may be a lot less than 50K. And if you don't mind, I would like to have Ken expand on that particular answer.
Ken, please.
Through the chair, when we originally came up with this motion with the councillor, the original thought was that 50,000 would just be added to the police budget, and of course, then the police could actually use it for any way they want, in particular Hess Village, or of course, Augusta Street, King William, wherever the issues were.
For Glanbrook for illegal operations.
Yeah, exactly. But for some reason, the police didn't want to include it in their budget, and so it's still in the bylaw that they are required to supply this pay duty. In the bylaw, and it is in the bylaw that the police are responsible, or the city is responsible for paying that. I certainly think if the police want to absorb it in their own current budget, then we probably wouldn't need it here, but of course that would have to be through the board to decide.
Okay, you didn't answer the question. The question I have is, why do you still need this when the officers won't sign up for it anyway? And so we've gone through a season now with virtually no paid duty out there. So why do we continue to put it as an enhancement when, as the ward council says, the makeup of the retailers has switched from nightclub to more to restaurants? So
Are we charging for a service they're not receiving?
Thank you.
Through the chair, the service that they are receiving gets paid through this account. So if the police aren't doing it, again, that'd be a question for the chief, and then you wouldn't need the budget. But currently, the bylaw itself still says that the city is responsible to pay for the amount of paid duties as indicated. The bylaw requires 3+1. Hopefully that answers your question.
Because you keep trying to kick it back to police on me. How much did you actually spend for paid duty from the city of Hamilton last year?
And through the chair, I don't have those numbers, no, but I do know it's below 50,000. And I could find those numbers for you, but I know it was below.
I'd like to see them because
I'll be closer to around 27, 28,000.
The senior command is They can't put paid duties officers out there because they won't sign up for it, and they don't have enough anyway to cover all the overtime that's required and all the other festivals. So why are you asking for another 50 grand? I don't get that.
So I'm reading between the lines. You want to table this one for more information?
If I can get support for that. I haven't had good luck at this, in this stuff.
Seconded
in
by
the past.
Councillor Farr. Are you okay with that? Maybe a smaller amount, Councillor, I think is what the point is. Go ahead.
And I have no trouble with that because I think we're going to come back and you're going to find that the saving, it was actually the number for 2018 was 30K, which actually mirrors the 30K that I've already saved us today in item CRO2. So no problem on the table, but it's
you're
going to be a
asking for
lot less than
50.
50. Yep, no problem.
So, motion to table then in light of the information that's been requested. Ken, you're clear in terms of what we want to come back as it relates to the numbers?
I am.
Okay, perfect. Moved by Ferguson, seconded by Farr that this one be tabled. Or Madam Clerk, do you need a, okay, I thought so. Carries, thank you. Now back to the list. And now we're on to licensing and bylaw services, 147,000.
Yes.
Jason?
So through the chair, from alcohol to cannabis. So number 6 is, if you recall, when we had a motion before council on the 23rd of January, that there was a portion of that motion that would have directed some of the provincial funding associated with the cannabis enforcement to provide for additional enforcement capacity with licensing and bylaw services. That part of the motion on the 23rd did not pass and instead was directed to the 2019 budget process. And we were asked to prepare a business case which was provided that identifies the enforcement needs in bylaw related to the legalization of cannabis. Why you are seeing there zero FTEs is because we anticipate that this would be an interim need. Not to create the permanent FTEs. We can deal with this with officers on contract, allows us to do a 24-month contract. At this point, we are anticipating that that is probably going to be sufficient. If it's not, we could come back in a future budget year, but we aren't seeking to make those permanent positions, only temporary. And the reason you see it as a zero net cost is that this would have the funding source of the Ontario Cannabis Implementation Fund.
Councillor Ferguson.
Will this be funded out of a reserve fund then, Jason?
So through the chair, I might need a bit of help from finance on this one. The direction from council was that the provincial funding be directed to a balance sheet account, so that would be the source of funding for these positions.
Okay, and that makes it easier, but through you to Ken. Ken, I'm not trying to be a boo bird on you all the time. I'm just trying to keep your taxes down. And so, since they did the raid on the I can't remember the name of the organization, and they reopened the next day, but they subsequently closed. And I understand there's been 5 or 6 others closed voluntarily because they know the cavalry's coming. And so, do you not anticipate this illegal cannabis issue, because it's got to be well below 20 now, is going to dissipate pretty quick, particularly now that we're going to have some legalized ones coming on stream?
Through the chair, we agree that the work that the police department has done has helped reduce the numbers. I think we currently have 14 that are operating, and of course this is the provincial team. But just to give you an overview of the work that our unit has done, and so as of January 14th, I brought 2 members together, one from licensing, one from municipal law enforcement. And in 3 weeks, we have identified 36 that were operating. We worked with the police department to close down 8. We've done 40 inspections. We shared 7 pieces of intelligence with the police to assist them to do their job. We participated in 4 raids. We've laid 39 charges in relation to administrative penalties and 17 that are going to the courts for POA. And those charges are in relation to property standards, yard maintenance, sign bylaws, and the licensing bylaws. So significant amount of work in 3 weeks. As directed by council, we are working collectively with the police department to put lots of pressure on these so that we can close down these illegal operations. We hope that we are successful in the next 6 months, but we're going to put the work towards it. And then, of course, we're waiting very patiently for site locations, to happen so that we can do our work in relation to that. But these two officers that I have temporarily brought in to do this work will deal with every cannabis file that we have coming into MLE, and they'll have that expertise. So from the neighbor complaint that's complaining about the smoking of their neighbor to the illegal grows to dispensaries, we are going to make them our experts and use the provincial money to help us do that.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think I'm prepared to support this now since it has zero impact on the levy, so that makes it more palatable. Still looks high, still looks like, you know, we don't license these people because their province won't let us, so, but I look forward to come back to saying next year we can drop to these contracts, so thank you.
Glad to have you back on board. Councillor Clark.
So the prescriptive process that the ministry put in place is where the funding is going to come from. So we're going to be documenting these expenditures as needs. Yeah, I'm not speaking to good English. It's just bad. I don't know what happened. I'm usually eloquent. Okay, stop it. So I just need confirmation that that's the case. So we've got that background work happening to make sure that if the ministry decides to audit and really be tight with the money and try to claw back, we have all of the evidence that we need to demonstrate that this was an actual need, that we had no choice, and that we did it, and here's the money.
Mike?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, short answer is yes, and we are still waiting for that framework from the ministry. They are consulting with municipalities to develop that framework. Once we have that framework, then we'll start to track that information. And as the councillor pointed out, it is subject to a review or audit from the province.
So this allotment of money, will it also address the grow-ops that are falling into the gray area? They're not a legal grow-op under Health Canada rules, but they're merging personal use licenses into a consortium to operate a grow-op, and they fall completely outside of Health Canada's regulations. And so far, nobody has been doing any enforcement on them. So can we as a municipality use this particular enforcement allocation to assist in those regards?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, to my previous comment is we're still developing, that framework is still being developed. That will be our comments to the ministry, is as it relates to defining eligible costs, that the nature of those functions that the councillor has identified should fall within that definition. You'll recall that this, in part, is triggered from the legalization of cannabis, but by extension there are other activities that we would argue fall within that overall theme or topic.
So can this budget allocation or other budget allocations deal with the development of policies that are going to deal with this? I know of at least 2 or 3 grow-ops that they've really just merged personal licenses for medical cannabis use, created a legal consortium, and they're flaunting Canada Health Guide rules and regulations, and yet we have a responsibility as a municipality to develop bylaws that protect health, safety, nuisance issues. This is clearly a gray area. There's no enforcement, so why can't the municipality look at policies to address that matter?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, you'll recall that the correspondence from the ministry was fairly broad, and as it relates to eligible costs, including internal administrative costs, legal costs. And again, we can take that message back to the ministry as it relates to eligible costs and the nature of the work that municipalities should be able to apply the proceeds to.
So I will take this process offline because there's a vacuum. Health Canada is not enforcing regulations on this type of consortium because it doesn't fall within their regulations. As a result, no one's dealing with smell, no one's dealing with noise, no one's dealing with all of the issues, security, lighting. And so in that vacuum, I think there's a responsibility and obligation for the municipality to develop a bylaw that specifically deals with people who are using this gray area to bring licenses together to create a grow-up that is, for all intents and purposes, looks legal, but it's not legal.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'd be happy to work with the councillor as it relates to a potential resolution that he may want to bring forward for council to endorse to help inform that framework that the ministry is developing in consultation with municipalities.
Thank you. I'll be doing that, Mr. Deputy. Thank you very much for your indulgence.
Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. And since we're talking about cannabis, I just want to give a loud applause to what this august body seriously desired and wished of our police services, to shut down the illegal operations, the illicit stores of the marijuana businesses, some 32, I recall, in the last 2-3 weeks when Deputy Chief Dan Kinsella was here, and the outstanding job him and his team have done in conjunction with the Ontario Police as provincial police as well, with the increased tough legislation to the Ford government's credit that they instituted. And I think, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we're down to, I believe, less than 16, both from the closure and seizures of the police, as well as from voluntary closures as well. So the message is getting out there, and hopefully the last number left will be eventually 0. So I just want to state that and give that as update to my colleagues who aren't on the Police Services Board. Mr. Deputy Mayor, through to Director Leenders. So Ken, what's the downside if we do not approve this? Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Through the chair, there is work to be done. The downside would be that I would have to take existing members and take them away from work that they're currently doing to assist the police in doing some of the work, or municipal law enforcement not do anything. And and you know, the working hand in hand with our police service has been one of our hallmarks, and certainly some of the information we can obtain makes it much easier for law enforcement to do the work. And certainly the direction from the council is to shut these down, and that's what we're going to do. Part of the job also is to ensure that this council and our community have their say on where the new locations are going to go, and we have a team all set to do that as well. So if that's, of course, not funded through what this grant money is for, then we'll have to use existing services so that we can ensure that the delegated authority that you have given my division is, of course, enacted. So this is just the horsepower needed to do everything that needs to be done in relation to this file.
Thanks, Ken, and forgive me, I definitely wasn't ignoring your MLE's contribution. And I've always said from time to time, especially at a moment like this, how fortunate we are to have somebody like you who has the two-hat scenario as former deputy police chief. You fully understand that enforcement and from the municipal law enforcement standpoint as well. So thanks for what you've done. So a subsequent question, Mr. Deputy Mayor, from what you've explained now, the downside. This funding is strictly at this time from the provincial government. And some issues for some of us that didn't vote to opt in was that potentially would the money run out after a year or two? So is this how long will this $147,000 carry you? And now that we've opted in as a municipality, will you be expecting similar amounts down the road from the province, or will it end up potentially on the municipal levy? Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Ken, please.
Through the chair. We anticipate it's about $220,000 a year. It is a temporary funding from the province, and so we believe within 2 years our work will be done. Within 2 years, the dispensaries will be settled, the locations will be seated accordingly. I mean, if we could anticipate, when the illegals were here, we had 85. We could anticipate more than that, although I know the first run we might only get 3 to 4. And so there's work that needs to be done on that. But within 2 years, most of the dispensaries will be located. Hopefully all the illegals will be shut down. and our work will be done. And so in 2 years, this temporary funding, whatever is left, of course, will be for the province or council to decide. But from my point of view, the 147 for this year and hopefully next year to continue on another 220,000, it won't even put a dent in the first payment that was given to the province, given to the city by the province.
Okay, Ken, so I accept the sincerity of your answer, and I would simply ask, as I often do departments when we have senior levels of government funding on any program with any department over the years, that if that funding ever ran out and/or it didn't end up covering, in spite of your best intentions and what you've indicated and predicted for us this morning, that you and Kelly Barnett behind you, one of your managers, would at least take under advisement this date, and a year or two from now, all still within this term of council, if something changed where suddenly there may be a financial impact to the municipal levy, you would bring that to this body as soon as possible. Is that fair, Ken?
Through the chair, you rest assured we certainly would.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Mayor Fred.
Thank you. I just wanted to reiterate as well what Councillor Jackson just mentioned in terms of the success the police are having in terms of shutting down the cannabis locations. We're not there yet completely, but they've done some really good work. They've actually seized property, and I think and locked them up and put security cameras on so that they don't reopen again. There was an attempt to reopen a few of them that wasn't successful. And some have actually voluntarily closed, knowing that the law is coming at some point. So his answer to me is that they need to be sure that they've got everything lined up so that when it hits the courts, they're not going to be tossed out because they missed something. So there's a real need to be clear. And the police are also quantifying and documenting any additional cost over and above their normal policing costs that they're incurring as a result of this, because there is a $10 million fund out there, and there's, I think, a belief that the province expects that police services will be applying against those funds to recover some of the costs. So that's happening on the police side as well. And, this should be temporary in many respects, until such time as this whole illegal market issue settles down, which I'm sure it will over time. But I do appreciate the good work that's going on, and we need collaboration between bylaw and policing to make this successful. And so, having that temporary fund in place is going to be, I think, very important to ensure that that happens. So I thank them all for that good work, and hopefully before too long we'll have the illegal ones out, and then we'll go from there.
Councilor White, did you check your name off the list? Okay. I need a motion then to approve this one that has no levy impact. Moved by Pearson, seconded by Ferguson. What? Really? Okay. Or Eisenberger. All those in favor? Carries. Thank you. Just wait for the next one on the list to come up. The City Manager's Office City Enrichment Fund. Mike, you addressing that one? Or John?
Thank you. Through the chair, just to kick this off, a number of members of council or committee have been members of the grant subcommittee, and this essentially is, I'll say, bringing into perspective or reality what has been, I'll refer to it as an annual dip into the reserve for a number of organizations that subcommittee and ultimately council has approved each year for an amount of money. And within the envelope of funds available, it was not possible to provide the level of funding that committee supported. So in the past year, as we went through the exercise, which we're coming up to again fairly soon, it was suggested that in each of these unique cases, that as opposed to dipping into the reserve each time, we should deal with it and actually building into the funding envelope.
Councillor Johnson.
Yep, thank you, and thank you for that, John. I know how hard the staff work at processing every single application and making the recommendations. If you could just do me a favor, please, John. I know you mentioned about the reserves, but would you agree that they took a heavy hit this past year because of the United Way shortages?
Through the chair, that's correct. And I believe at the time that we took those actions, the reserve went down to about $36,000. And now that we've looked at the year end, it's been topped up slightly, but it still is only now about roughly $83,000.
Right.
Whereas historically, we were, $250 to $400 a range.
And would you please remind everyone what the budget is for the Grants Committee every year?
The budget is approximately $6.3 million in total.
So just to let some of the people that don't understand the grants process, this is a process that actually gives the money to all the festivals and to all the social service programs, your baseball leagues and your soccer leagues. And there were a number of organizations that didn't apply last year because they thought they were getting their funding through the United Way. Now that the United Way has cut them off, they are now going to be coming through that process, and we're going to need the extra money to take a look at their applications and recommend how much money they get. So I'm in full support of this.
There's actually 4 people behind me, but that's okay. Look, I support the principle, but, the whole grants process doesn't mean that people are automatically getting the same amount every year. I mean, there's supposed to be a healthy tension to become self-sustainable where they can, and there are some that are legacy in the context. We understand the limitations, and therefore we obviously have to step up to the plate. So, and I think the previous council clearly identified the challenge that the Grants Committee had with the United Way doing and chopping off funding that was relied on. So that we were looking at a transition period for those organizations. But it wasn't assumed that we would be picking up that differential because you still got competing interests with those grants. So help me understand then, what is our philosophy now? Understanding what happened to the United Way, understanding that there's many great organizations, but also understanding the whole principle of the grants program in the context of creating a healthy tension to ensure that we're moving towards, in some areas, a level of sustainability.
Thank you, Councillor, and through the chair. One of the things, thanks to the support of the grant subcommittee that we've done each year, is to refine the process and make it increasingly consistent across all of the 6 program areas. We are at a point now where we feel very comfortable that each application is not only adjudicated against the same criteria, scored against consistent criteria, but the funding allocated or recommended to the subcommittee is very, very consistent based on the guidelines that have been refined over the years. So for example, to the councillor's question through the chair or comment, that when we would take into account, for example, any additional organizations, whether they're new to the community or they're new to the program because of a change in their funding from other sources, they go into and through the same adjudication process as all others. And there's I'll say a ranked comparison based on their scores. We deal with roughly 300 applications for close to 300 individual organizations and programs. And each one is, when we present it in usually around the April timeframe to the subcommittee, we identify in a very transparent way all of the scores, and for each and every one there's a mini business case attached to it as well. And then the committee signed off, if you will, on the process, whereby if you score greater than X, then relative to the ask, our staff will recommend a certain amount of money. One thing I wanted to mention as well, that we have consistently applied a 30% guideline. In other words, it is not the intention of the program to completely fund programs. That would be more of an operational consideration. But as a grant program, we do not exceed in our recommendations 30% of the total value or cost of that program. When we topped up 6 organizations last year, the ones that we did top up were ones who are already part of the City Enrichment Fund, and they were topped up for a total amount of money of $140,000, but that quite honestly put all of them over the 30% mark. So as we are looking at it again this year, it's starting with a fresh view. It's not assumed that we would continue to do that.
Okay, so I have the list that's identified in the book, and I believe that we had an obligation to help these organizations with the transition. But understanding the principles as you've identified, I was concerned that now are we changing if we change the rules for them, we're going to have to change the rules right across the board, and that will have a significant impact in regards to who can get funded, because you're going to be eating up the very little funding you have. So are you suggesting then with this $93,000 that this is going to be an annualized expenditure going through the next in perpetuity, or this is still that transition period that we're addressing?
Through the chair, just to clarify, this list of organizations is not the full list of those that we topped up for United Way. It is a list of organizations that I'll say on an annual basis would come forward with a request that we could not fulfill the entire request because of the limit of the funding envelope. So a committee would put forth a motion on each of these individually, asking for it to be, quote, topped up out of the reserve. And it just seemed that was probably not the right way to go on a sustainable basis, particularly because we were driving the reserve down to close to zero. So it was recommended by the subcommittee that we actually bring those individual cases into the budget process for consideration. So it would add this amount of money, which, $93,000, which is the sum of the amounts that we've typically been dipping into the reserve for these specific organizations.
So I appreciate that clarification. When I look at the list, it appears that it's inclusive of both. Am I correct? So you're talking about the legacy pieces that we could continue dipping into the reserve. Fair enough. I understand that piece. Again, back to the United Way piece. Is that? I got the list here. Is that also incorporated in that $93,000?
Through the chair, no. They were treated as a one-off consideration, and this, I would say, were organizations that, without that consideration, were coming in with a request annually that we had to top up at the subcommittee level to meet an obligation for those individual organizations.
And just remind me, they met the criteria otherwise?
Yes, through the chair, yes. They're all fully qualified, and an example might be that if the staff recommendation in year one was $10,000 to a particular organization, and at the subcommittee level, it was recommended by members of the committee that it should be $12,000, and so that additional $2,000 at that point would have been taken from the reserve. This list in front of you are organizations where that was happening, I'll say it, pretty much year after year. So it was subcommittee's recommendation that we actually bring those same organizations forward to the budget process so that they could be, or that the envelope could be increased so that those organizations could then be served, I'll say, within the funding envelope as opposed to dipping into the reserve each year.
I appreciate it. I'm just looking at it, and there is another theme that is being created when you go through this geographically. So that's something I'll take offline, because I'm trying to understand how they got caught up geographically in this. Is it just a coincidence or not, in respect to that annualized more dollars than staff were recommending category, when it seems to me that geographically it's pretty consistent with the organization we're impacted by that. So I'll take that offline. Thank you.
Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And just a couple of quick questions. John, can you remind us, when did we blow apart the grants process, if you will, and create the new enrichment fund?
If memory serves, which on a Friday I can't guarantee, through the chair, I believe our launch of the new program was in 2015 application year. We had received committees and council's approval for the design in 2014, and then to be effective 15. And we've evolved it each year since that time.
All right, thank you. And yes, I think 2015 is accurate. So basically, it's been 3 years since we did that process, correct?
Through the chair, yes, that's for the full term, or excuse me, the full process, yes.
Right. And so my question is, and I certainly don't have a problem with the approach or with those that are on the list, although I do have a question about a couple of them. But, you know, is it fair to say that there has been a number of issues with grant applications being submitted by groups that would previously have been funded, but with the new formula are falling short? Am I clear? Is that clear?
I believe so, Councillor. And through the chair, I don't think, from my recollection, that it would be so much about organizations that were previously falling short. But that certainly for some organizations became, I'll say, the benefit of a full adjudication. If I can give a specific example, in some of the larger organizations, and I'll use Theatre Aquarius as an example.
Right.
If you recall, at one time, they had been moved out of the, I think it was called the Community Partnership Fund at the time.
Yes.
It'd been moved out of that into boards and agencies. And then bringing them back into the City Enrichment Fund was the first time that they'd actually been adjudicated, I'll say. And through that adjudication process, it was much easier to substantiate the amounts of money that they needed. Always the asks, I'll say, were higher than what we could provide, but at least there was a methodology to truly evaluate the need and the benefits to the community to help us with the funding. So in some cases, especially when previous council was kind enough to increase the arts funding, as an example, over a 3-year period, and we also did another $500,000 in funding for the non-arts programs. Some organizations clearly benefited from that compared to the funding they received before.
Right, and thank you for that. And so, Chair, the question I have, and certainly, you know, certainly for the ones in the Flamborough community, the Flamborough community has raised a significant amount of money for the United Way over the years, and you know, two organizations were being funded, and now there's none, absolutely none. They've pulled all their funding, and so there are no organizations in Flamborough, and I know it's similar in for my colleagues in some of their other areas, and that has really significantly hurt these organizations. So, Chair, I just wanted to say how much, you know, they appreciate, and certainly I appreciate, that we've been able to step up on that. The one question I have, though, if you look at the total of $93,200, and again, I don't have a problem with these, but I just need to ask the question. Most of them are $10,000 or less, but there is one, being the Brought Music Festival, that's at $40,000. Why is that? Or what is that ask for, that $40,000?
Yes, through the chair, that has been increased to the level of $40,000 over the last few years, and it was in a response to the demise, I'll say, of Opera Hamilton, and the Brought Music Festival has come forward trying to rebuild opera in the city and worked with the subcommittee to present a case that actually had the caveat in it that if you get, it was in a 2-year piece, if you get $20,000, you'll do one more opera, and they did. And then they came back, and again, there was a similar thing last year that it was increasing specifically their programs in opera for the community beyond their previous program slate, I'll say.
Okay.
And if I may just add, part of the discussion, as I recall, was that prior to the to Opera Hamilton going out of business, they were receiving through the program or similar previous program something in the area, if I'm recalling correctly, about $130,000 or $40,000. So
It was 135.
135. And so this was subcommittee's support, I'll say, in those discussions for increasing the funding to also increase the number of performances in the community to backfill for opera. And it's my understanding, I know Councillor Ferguson has become a major opera fan as a result. He, that the performance, I know, shocking, isn't it?
I'm keeping a straight face here.
The performances have been extremely well attended, and I think confirmed the level of interest and support from a patron base in the community.
And I know certainly, Chair, the Brat Festival has been expanding outside of the city and has done a few performances out in Flamborough at St. Thomas the Apostle Church, which have been outstanding and very, very well attended. But again, I think we've done a terrific job, Chair, in funding the arts community, and specifically organizations such as this. My concern is that we have other organizations that are catering to seniors, who are in some cases the only programming they get are through some of these organizations. It is very much a growing demographic. And these programs are very important to them and their quality of life. And I don't want to see them suffer or that it be detrimental to them, because we only have so much money. 6.3 million, I think you said, for the total amount of the enrichment fund. Sounds like a lot of money, but Chair, it really, when you look at the number of agencies across the city, and we must treat them all fairly, I think I'd like to see a clearer lens, if you will, kind of put on that angle of it. Those are my questions, and thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you. Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Sorry I had to step out for a phone call. So back to, I think Councillor Johnson had raised the issue, and Councillor Whitehead, about the United Way angle. So, John, is any of this 93 grand part and parcel picking up where we gave one time last year in an emergency situation to help organizations that suddenly had reduced or eliminated funding from the United Way? Is any of this part and parcel of those organizations? Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor?
Through the chair, no, these are, that the 6 organizations that were helped was done on a one-time standalone basis.
Okay, and so then let me piggyback on that. How have the conversations gone, John, since we were, I'll say politically, at the Grants Committee, blindsided, similar to, I believe, the organizations feeling they were somewhat blindsided by the late announcement from the United Way last year they'd have reduced or eliminated funding. I think we gave you a mission in your wonderful way to open up a conversation with United Way leadership and to find out how we were going to prevent this in the future. Can you possibly give us an update on that, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through to John?
Through the chair, happy to do that. And I would say that they've been extremely collaborative in trying to advance things in our community. We have had a few meetings with them, initially just the leadership team, and more recently we've established a working team, and we've actually invited the Hamilton Community Foundation to participate as well. Our notion being that probably between the three of us, we would be the three major grant providers in the community. And it just felt intuitively that we should understand better and speak more regularly about how we're serving the community through that. So, if I could paint the picture in your mind, I'm anticipating as we go forward with our more detailed look at this, that it's like a three-circled Venn diagram. And, somewhere in the middle, there's probably some areas where we can work better together to make sure that the resources in the community are being allocated in the right areas, and that even communication, fundraising, et cetera, that we can probably do more if we're talking than previously. So a quick sidebar to that, I would say that we, and I will potentially get the numbers wrong by one or two organizations, but I'll say approximately 20 organizations in our community were affected by the cutback, either to have their funds significantly reduced, or in the majority of cases, they were not provided with funds. We've met with all of those organizations to try to better understand what the impacts were. And I don't have that summary with me, but we know that they've all, I'll say, found a way to stay afloat, either by cutting back on a program area or staff or both, and are continuing to exist, I'll say. So we're happy about that side of it. We specifically topped up 6 of those 20 because they were existing organizations within the City Enrichment Fund. So we're working very collaboratively with United Way, with our own team, trying to understand how we can best serve and improve where we can the fundraising capability for the city, so that the 3-year obligations, which United Way has made to the organizations that have received funding, that in fact they have enough money to fulfill those obligations while we continue to build the fundraising capacity within the community. I will also want to mention that, of course, I would say the majority, if not all, of the United Way clients that we have in common are part of our community services area under Grace Mader. So Grace is also at the table and making sure that we're working this through so that we have a clear lens on where the monies are coming from and being spent within the community.
So, very thorough answer, John, and you've raised my comfort level without creating a lot of work for your team before the first grants meeting. Could I put a simple request in that for the 20 some odd, that whatever your package comes forward, if you could put an asterisk, a footnote for those that are requesting grant money from the City of Hamilton and they formerly received funding from the United Way, but it either was reduced or eliminated, that would help me in light of the tremendous amount of competing interests we've had. If I recall, in past years, we've usually had $2 to $3 million more than the $6 million that usually is allotted each year by council. That would help me in terms of trying to support every organization that's worthy and qualified, but I don't want to necessarily punish or penalize the ones that lost United Way funding through no fault of their own. Mr. Deputy Mayor, through to John, is that possible he could include that in the upcoming reports?
Yeah, through the chair, yes, we'd be happy to do that, Councillor.
Perfect. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, sir. So how many grants do we issue in a year?
Through the chair, it varies, of course, each year a little bit, but I would say that an average would be close to 300 programs served and about 275 or 80 organizations, because it is, for some, they may have more than one program that they've requested funding.
How many applications do we receive?
In addition, we would receive probably another 50 or so.
So there were 50 organizations that were not successful in securing a grant?
Through the chair, in some of the cases, they have gone through the full process and have not qualified for one of a number of reasons, or their application was not strong enough, so they didn't score high enough. We have a benchmark of 60 and up gets consideration. And in some cases, they would have started an application process, but when we looked at their application, they either stopped it or they just didn't qualify. Not necessarily a real example, but this is only for not-for-profit organizations. So if we had a for-profit organization that tried to fill an application, they would not end up coming through the full piece.
So help me have the comfort and understanding that if we're going to be the stopgap for other charities who reduce their funding for whatever reasons, that we're not going to be treating other applicants who applied for funding with us at a different level than the organization that's coming in. An organization like United Way didn't raise enough money, so they couldn't answer all of their demands, as it were. We did the stopgap, and I understand council's desire, motivation to do that, to make sure that they were whole. How do we ensure that there weren't other applicants that didn't get a second look? If we'd added that extra money into the pot, would we have made decisions differently for other charities that had applied for funding from the city?
Through the chair, if I understand your question correctly, Councillor Clark, it probably is true that the difference between the ask, as I think Councillor Jackson was alluding to, the difference between what is asked for, even for qualified applicants, versus what we have the funds to, it's something, close to $8,000 is the ask, excuse me, $8 million. Usually through, so there always is I'll say a vetting process where we are not necessarily, even in terms of a qualification, I'll say, if someone were just to ask for $30,000, when staff go through the adjudication process relative to their budget and all the criteria, we might say, well, they actually really only qualify for 10. So there is always a gap between their ask and what staff recommends.
I guess my question is, how do we ensure that all applicants are being treated fairly, reasonably, and equally in their application when others are coming in at the last minute? Perhaps Catholic Charities next time decides that they don't have as much money because people aren't.
Through the chair, generally speaking, other than the United Way shortfall from last year, which was dealt with, I'll say, on the floor, more or less, in my time with the program, since we created the structure, everything has gone through a full application cycle. So, for example, between September 1st and November 1st is the application cycle. We do as much promotion of that as we can. We reach out to various organizations, try to make sure as best we can that we're including all of the both existing and potentially new organizations in the community to come in through the process, so we have one complete package that we're vetting on exactly the same criteria, the same scoring mechanisms, and same adjudication process.
I guess my question is, in 2020, another organization that's not the United Way didn't have enough money. As a result, their agencies received less funding, and those agencies now come to us and ask for the same treatment as we did with United Way. How do we prevent that from happening to ensure that all applicants are being treated equally, fairly, and reasonably?
Through the chair, I guess the one thing we always try to do is to make sure that all of the applications, for whatever reasons they may be new to the program, that they come in, if I can use the expression, through the front door and go through exactly the same equitable process. We in no way, I'll say, discriminate at that level. I guess the potential always exists that, I'll say, mid-year, when the monies have all been allocated, et cetera, something happens in the community and there's an outreach to the subcommittee, such as we experienced last year, and then the subcommittee and AFNA, et cetera, would deal with it. But the process is really designed to prevent that.
And so do we have comfort now in dealing with the United Way? We understand what their policies, procedures are, why they made the decisions, what expectations will happen this year, so that this does not become an ongoing backdoor safety valve if they don't raise enough money. Well, Hamilton will do it.
Through the chair, we've made that abundantly clear that we are not in a position to carry on with that. It was a one-time event, and our goal is to help them be successful at what they do and be, I'll say, an optimization of funds for us as well.
Okay.
That would not be part of the program going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I'm supportive of the motion. Thank you very much, John, for your help.
Councillor Nan.
Thank you. Just for a clarifying question, I've heard reference to $6.3 million in total for the enrichment fund, and yet in the operating budget book it says 6.02. Can I just get clarity on that?
So through you,
unless I'm
Mr.
missing
Deputy
something.
Mayor, it is 6 million, I believe, and 22,000.
And if I can, through the chair, just add to that, the total of 6.3 was as a result of the increased use of the reserve, the City Enrichment Fund reserve, which brought it up to that amount, but it's not the budgeted amount, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have no further speakers, and I'm not sure whether I took a mover and a seconder on this enhancement, but I'll go to Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Partridge. All those in favor? Carries, thank you. Brian, that's 6.1. Then, Madam Clerk, we need a motion on 6.1 as amended, or are you good with the motions we put individually for those enhancements? Gotcha. Okay, 6.2, Brian? Clerk?
May we get a mover and seconder on the first presentation?
Yep.
Receive it.
On receipt of the presentation, moved by Clark, seconded by Pearson. All those in favor? Carries, thank you.
So moving on to item 6.2, the business case, budget enhancements. So similar to the process we just followed. We'll go through the business cases. So the business cases, they represent staff initiatives that are supporting our approach to business planning. So what you're going to have in front of you is there's 12 business cases. I'll refer you again to budget book 1, which was Appendix A. These are in Appendix 1.6 or 1-6 in that book. For those, that's where all the details are. And similar to the process we just followed, I'll give an overview now, and then the general managers and directors and staff will help with the process. So there's 12 business cases in that package, 4 from economic development, 1 which is joint with corporate services, 1 from corporate services, and 7 from the city manager's office. So typically, these are initiatives that can't be absorbed by the existing FTEs, or in some cases, temporary FTEs are being converted to permanent FTEs, and you'll hear that during some of the discussion. The impact of these are not built into the budget. These will be on top of that number. So we have another additional 0.1% tax increase if all of these are approved. And so similar to before, when it shows net zero, there are revenue sources that are funding that gross cost of those projects. So we will go to, starting with Planning and Economic Development and Corporate Services on the first one.
Okay, Brian.
And I'll return to my seat
Yeah,
then.
that's fine, that works, excellent, thank you, Acting General Manager. The Deputy Mayor's just stepped out for a few minutes, he'll be right back. Okay, so let's go through them again, one by one, and what's the questions and answers and deliberation? BCO1. BCO1 moved by Councillor Farr, seconded by Councillor Pearson. I see no one queuing up. And just when I said I see no one queuing up, Councillor Ferguson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson, Councillor Jackson, Esquire. The 443,000, or the Senior Business Development Consultant, I didn't have a chance to read the backup. Could somebody just quickly tell me what they're going to do?
General Manager?
So through the chair, there are 3 positions in here. This is actually a joint enhancement coming forward from real estate and from legal. And these are all related to real estate transactions. So the Senior Business Development Consultant deals with processing of real estate transactions. This is a position that does currently exist. It was created as a contract position about a year and a half ago to deal with some of the increased volume of transactions coming in. It was done as a contractual basis to see if the workload sustained the position. And our recommendation is that, yes, it does. We want to make that position permanent, but there is no net levy impact because it is funded through fee recovery.
Fuel recovery? Fee recovery. Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Ferguson. All right. And you have inspired others, Councillor Ferguson. Thank you so much. Councillor Partridge, please.
Inspired may not be a word I'd use, but okay.
I'll let the suburban
no
folks
smacking.
work that out.
It's Friday, all in good fun.
Councillor, the floor is yours.
So thank you. No, I appreciate that. And Chair, I appreciate the previous answer, but did I hear correctly that it will have no impact on the levy?
General Manager?
Through the chair, that's correct. The costs are recovered through fees. It's just a question of making the positions FTE. So we're only seeking FTEs.
Okay, so it's going to be recovered in fees, but then, Chair, at the very beginning, I did hear from Brian that it was, everything on this list was going to result in a 0.1% increase because it was not, none of this is included in the current 3.2. Is that correct?
Acting General Manager of Finance?
Yeah, so through the chair, yeah. Yes.
Yeah?
Would that be a little more formal, please, Brian?
So yeah, through the chair. So
no, I know.
these business cases
Yeah.
result in a 0.1% additional tax impact. This particular business case has no net levy impact
Because
because
these are all fees.
the revenue is coming from some additional fees.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Partridge. Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, and I appreciate the fact that it's coming from the fees, but will we be receiving an annual report indicating what the expenditures were in this division and what the offsets were from the fees? These numbers really add up.
Who wants to take that?
So through you, so through the chair, if approved, it would be captured in our variance report. So the variance reports, if this were to be a driving factor in terms of a variance, that would be reported through our variance reports.
So what happens if the fees don't match the numbers that are being proposed here? Where does the money come from?
So through the chair, it typically comes from gapping. So council has set a gapping target to the departments of $4.5 million. It would have to, our actual gapping would have to exceed the $4.5 million. We would have to drive some additional gapping dollars. If we weren't able to achieve it through employee-related savings, then we would look within the department first to see if there were other savings or efficiencies. If not at the departmental level, then we would look corporately.
So I'm assuming then, and forgive me if it's incorrect, that when you're stating these are all covered by fees, that you actually have some document somewhere that indicates we have the revenue coming in from these programs to cover these fees, but we don't have that in our report.
Jason, Mike, please.
So through the chair, yes. So this is based on what we've seen as an increased activity level coming through real estate, which is driving increased revenues. As I noted, the senior business development consultant position already exists and was created on a temporary basis to deal with some of the increased volumes. And so it has been generating its fees to support it as a contract position. So what we're suggesting now is that we made a permanent position and that those fees that were covering it as a contract position would continue to cover it on a go-forward basis.
I guess, Mr. Deputy Mayor, Mr. Chairman, my concern is that we're hearing that these expenditures are going to be covered off by the fees from this different department, but we're actually not receiving the accounting that's indicating what those departments' fees are and what revenue they're generating that shows the offset. And the argument that it'll just, if we don't make the money, we'll do it in gapping or we'll do it in variances actually removes any oversight by the council in terms of where the money's going and whether or not we have the revenue to fund those projects. That's my concern.
So through the chair, one alternative potential funding source, if there were to be unfavorable, would be through the property purchases reserve, which would require council approval. So that would provide council with oversight as it relates to what transpires in year. That's an option.
Okay.
So there has to be a way to actually have a report that shows exactly what these expenditures cost and others in that division. And if we're saying they're being covered by revenue that is not levy-based, then we actually can show where the money is, what the money is, on a year-to-year basis. Otherwise, we're just approving an increase. We don't know really where it's going. We don't know whether or not the variances or the gapping will cover it. And we don't know the revenue that is being generated to offset those costs.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if I understand the comment, committee could direct staff through the variance reports is to include within the variance report some summary as to what has transpired as it relates to fee generation specific to these positions. So within the planning and economic development summary of that report, we could include actual year-to-date experiences as it relates to the positions and the offsetting revenues.
I can only speak for myself, but I think I would feel more comfortable with that if we actually have some accounting in 2020 showing exactly what happened in 2019. We take the staff at their word in terms of what this is and there's money available, but let's understand exactly what did transpire. Were our projections accurate or not? And did we have to go to another fund to pay for these fees? So I'd be happy to move that. Thank you.
I'm not certain that requires a motion. We can just do that as staff direction. Is that fine with you, Mike, in terms of making a note for that?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we will incorporate that into all three variance reports, the two in-year and the year-end variance report.
All right. Thank you. And do we want to we'll do these individually as we did last time then. So on the first position listed there on the chart, a mover and a seconder with those, with the direction. Moved by Farr, second by Jackson. All those in favor? Correct. Thank you. Next position on the list, Jason?
Yeah, so through the chair, similar to the first one, this again is a position that exists as a temporary contract position that we're seeking to make permanent. Again, it's got no levy impact. This is a position that administers and implements a provincially funded program, the Starter Company program. For councillors who aren't familiar with the Starter Company program, it's been ongoing for a few years now, and it's the program through which staff work with youth who are out of school, who want to start a business. They provide training, mentorship. They administer a provincial grant program as well. So this is a position that, again, has been funded by the province for some time. We have completed the 2018 funding program. We're negotiating now with the extension through to 2019. It has been a recurring program for about 4 years now. And the recommendation to make the position permanent, we are up against the limit in terms of what we can approve as a contract through the complement control policy. We do have some confidence that the program will continue, so that there's a rationale for making the position permanent. I would note that if for some reason in the future, at any point in the future, the provincial program is cut, then the program would be cut and the position would be cut. But at this point, we're confident that through 2019, the program will continue. And we would need to extend the person who is administering that program today. And our suggestion is that we make that a permanent FTE, because I said we have reasonable confidence that this has been a successful program, and we've had no indications that it's going to be eliminated anytime soon. And we would like to make that position permanent within the department.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So General Manager, this officer is earmarked to helping young people, graduates of our colleges, universities, to get employment. Could you elaborate on that a little further, please?
Through the chair, that's correct, to start businesses. So we have administered about 87 grants, close to $500,000 in grants to support these youth out of school to start up businesses.
I believe a group of McMaster's students from the union will be coming in Monday. And if you happen to be here, Jason, if your schedule allows, I think they'll be speaking to some form of an urban fellow program that has been adopted in Toronto, where graduates will be employed by the City of Hamilton to assist to keep the brains of our young people working with meaningful employment in our city. So I don't know if maybe if you're around Monday, I think Monday's our town hall delegation day, that it may be a companion type of program, or this may tie in with that. But anyways, I just thought I'd give you a little advance notice on that. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So, in the interest of time and understanding what Mr. Zagarik's comments were with regards to the variance and reporting back on the next 3 items, I'd be happy to move B, C 02, 03, and 04. And the same reporting would come back as through variances.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, they need to be done independently of each other.
Okay, I was trying to help you. It's your fault.
A mover and a seconder then. Councillor Jackson, you want to move that one? This position? Second by Councillor Pauls. All those in favor? Electronic vote required. Carries. Next position. Second by Councillor Clark. It was moved by Councillor Partridge. Councillor Pauls.
Yes, on BC03, I just basically wanted to know, the trainer, how many students do they train?
Through the chair, this is a new position that we created. We have 16 students that currently work for municipal law enforcement. That includes 4 Westdale/Mohawk students, 2 co-ops, 2 graffiti students, the 4 waterfall students, and of course, then we also bring in 4 summer students. So they'll be training those students, but also, and coordinating them, but also this trainer will be training the rest of the municipal law enforcement people. So we'll be diverting the training pay that our officers normally take to this one position, and we'll have more consistency in training, plus we'll have a better focus on how we manage our students.
That's great, because at the BIA, they were there, and they were telling us all about the graffiti. It was very good, and it was a good program, so thank you.
thank you very much. On the next position, who's going to describe that one? Okay, on 4. Seconded by Councillor Farr. All those in favor? Okay, on 05, that is the city procurement, issuing procurements on behalf of City Housing Hamilton, and this flowed through an audit from our internal auditor, Charles Brown, who audited City Housing, and I know that Tom Hunter's here as well from City Housing Hamilton to answer any questions, and this is following up on the approved recommendations that flowed through the audit and will be funded through City Housing Hamilton's budget. Councillor Clark.
Fully supportive, just asking for some clarity, because on the document pages, it shows there's a tax levy, but it's showing net levy of 0, so I'm not sure where the money's coming from then.
Comes from City Housing Hamilton's budget, and we are meeting this year's budget target. Mike, you wanna, or Brian?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, would be a restatement, taking the funding from City Housing in Hamilton,
So we
putting
fund
it
City
over
Housing and then
to
they pay for
procurement.
it.
So it is matching the funding with the FTE and the workload.
Thank you. Councillor Farr. Moved by Councillor Farr, seconded by Councillor Clark. All those in favor, electronic vote, please. Carries, thank you. City Manager's Office, Digital Media Administrator.
Thank you, and through the chair, if I can provide a little context for that particular request. This is, if you're familiar with Bonnie Large, who manages our Hamilton.ca website, the city app, etc. A little history, prior to that team being set up, there were over, and the new website, there were over 100 authors spread around the city with, as you can imagine, different degrees of skill and control. With the new website, that group was centralized, and there is, I'll say Bonnie is the supervisor and 3 people. With the, thankfully, I'll say with the trend towards increased use of digital services, the city app's a good example. These folks are now handling, on average in 2018, 980 requests per month for changes, enhancements, et cetera, to the website. And at one point, 1 month, I should say, it hit 1,300, but over the year, it's averaged out to 980, and it's trending upward. So what is happening, of course, is that with that increased volume, which is all for good reasons, we've also been trying to take a more, I'll say, centralized approach to minimize outsourcing of other things as well. So they do an awful lot of consulting. They have, on average, about 45 projects at any point in time that they're consulting on across the corporation, helping them do things, I'll say, within Hamilton.ca, as opposed to going out and, building, paying outsourced contractors to build little microsites, et cetera. We've had some wonderful success on that. But of course, all of that, plus the fact that they are, I'll say, on call, and we do it on a scheduled basis, they're on call for all of those things that are happening across the city at odd hours of the night and weekends, et cetera, whether it's storm alerts and that kind of thing. So it has ended up in, I'll say, consuming considerable amount of overtime, which we don't have budget to pay for. So of course, then we give them time in lieu, which then just kind of, it's, feels like a bit of a hamster kind of situation where it just gets worse. With the growth, I'll say, of the digital office under Andrea McKinney's leadership now, that's just going to increase as well, because we operationalize what Andrea is working on. So if we're adding different services, et cetera, to the website, in fact, we're going through an exercise this year of upgrading the website in terms of a new release. So it's just one of those where, unfortunately, for all the right reasons and good reasons, it's ended up in a capacity that we're requesting today additional funding for a junior position within the team. That will free the more senior people up to catch up on backlog as well as to do the higher value work and just quite frankly to handle the growing volume which we're pleased to receive, but there is a certain capacity that you just can't go beyond.
Thanks, John. Councillor Jackson, and then I have myself on the list.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So Director, in hearing all that, what's the downside if we don't approve this?
Through the chair, the downside would be that requests from across the corporation are delayed in terms of implementations. It makes it difficult to advance some of the new projects that are on the books now and will be coming down the road. And I don't know if I should mention or not at a department, but I'll just for example's sake, we were working with one of our departments who was going out to spend operating budget money on developing their own website, a microsite, because they have a unique requirement. And we spent considerable numbers of weeks and hours advising, working with them to design a new template that we could actually operate within Hamilton.ca to save them that money and do it in-house. Those are the kind of things we would be less capable of doing. So I think although there's a hard expenditure here, I think there is an advantage and I'll say indirect savings that are a little tricky to measure, but it's just one of those capacity issues for volume. That would be the downside.
John, is it, if we approve this, could you a year from now, possibly in the next budget of 2020, just give committee and council an update on the results and uptake that this extra position provided your division to do, please, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor?
Through the chair, we'd be happy to, and if there's a group within my group that does great detail tracking, that would be easy to do based on the systems in place.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor. I'll ask Councillor Farr to take the chair. We'll ask my question. And through you, Mr. Chairman. John, the only concern I have is that historically, as we've gravitated more services to the web, we found internal savings, whether it's counter space or time that we've spent on the phone, to pay for those enhancements by driving services online rather than doing them in person or in other forms. So no opportunity here to look for savings internally, or, conversely, you've given a couple of examples where departments were poised to go out and spend resources externally. So it sounds like somebody had a budget to do something. You've intervened. You've probably saved them some money. So no resources flowing your way from those departments who were poised to go outside and instead have found savings by utilizing your staff services?
Through the chair, in this specific case, my short answer would be no, not at this point in time. You'll see in a couple of other things I have as a request today, we've done exactly that, Councillor, and gone out and use monies that would otherwise have been spent on outsourcing to bring in to one of my groups to then be able to do the work on their behalf. We've not in this case, because most of the sheer volume is, I'll say, sort of bits and pieces. I mean, you kind of imagine what 980 requests per month looks like. They're not big assignments so much. It's just changes, add this, take that out. It's the refresh, if you will. I think there are a few projects, like the example I gave, where we could certainly look at doing a better assessment, I'll say, of the opportunity, and then perhaps go back through department colleagues and others to see if there is a way for future requirements. But I can honestly say we don't have that kind of opportunity right in front of us.
Thank you. And my concern on a go-forward basis would be the trends are going to continue, that those numbers are going to increase. At some point in time, you're over 1,000 and then beyond. And so I think I would like to know at some point in time in the near future what metrics we're using to determine you know, when we look at shifting in a different direction or some kind of another funding source, because we are pushing more services to the web. Departments will increasingly be calling you to suggest that we need to make small or medium or large changes, and that request for service will obviously then drive up costs. So
Through the
those are
chair,
my concerns.
if I could offer, I mean, one of the other parts of my division that we're working across the city is in the area of continuous improvement. And, you know, that might be an interesting metric that we add into the continuous improvement side of things, that as we're doing these things, who should be the benefactors and what would be the potential budgetary positive implications.
Okay. Thanks for that. If you can keep that on the radar screen, then, John, I'd appreciate it. I'll take the chair back from Councillor Farr. I have no further speakers then. I need a mover and a seconder then on BC 06. Moved by Danko, seconded by Jackson. All those in favor? I think, is that it for 6.2 for us then? Or we still have another page, sorry. Wishful thinking, I guess. There we go.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if possible, if we could go to B11 and 12, we just have staff who have some prior commitments this afternoon, other work-related obligations, and I'm just wondering if, just in order for Gord to be here to help us, guide us through the discussions on BC 11 and BC 12.
Let's do that. Do you want to walk us through that then, or is that someone else's mic?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll start with BC 11. BC 11 relates to the mediation and arbitration costs that are reflected in HR, and it's really a right sizing of the budget is what's before you. The budget was set in 2009 and never adjusted to reflect actuals. When I look back over the last 5 years, save and except for 1 year, 2006, the actuals in 2006 was approximately 506,000. Each and every year, 2016, each and every year other than 2016, actuals exceeded budget, ranging from about 130,000 to about 700,000 over and above budget. So what is before you with respect to the $230,000 to reflect more of the 5-year actual costs as it relates to mediation and arbitration costs?
Thanks, Mike. Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And just to further dig into that comment, thank you, Mike. I'm just wondering, when you referenced that the costs exceeded, was that because of overtime? Was that because of having to bring in an additional staff person? What was behind that? I'm just trying to get a handle around it. You know, is this an additional staff person that we're now looking at bringing in? Because, I mean, it says no. It says zero.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll ask Gord if he can expand on what transpired historically. And if I can just, I know I was very focused on the budget, just for everyone's benefit, in those years where it has exceeded budget, it has fallen out as part of the year-end variance and would result from a transfer from the tax stabilization reserve effectively, or a reduction in the size of the variance. So effectively, we are funding it at year-end, we just aren't budgeting for this properly.
All right, so we're not looking at, Chair, we're not looking at an additional FTE, which is clearly what it says on the report here. So what's behind the cost? What I'm looking for, is there overtime involved, or?
Through you, Mr. Chair. No, there's not an additional FTE. These are costs attributed to contract services, arbitrators and mediators.
Right.
In one line, so there's 2 lines. There's a contract line, which is specifically for mediators and arbitrators, and a second line, which is legal fees, which is the lawyers, the external lawyers we hire externally to litigate all of the cases that we have, the human rights cases, the arbitration cases, WSIB challenges, LTD cases that we're appealing, all of those types of cases.
Okay, so this is as a result of external legal that we need to bring in or contract, right?
Mr. Deputy Mayor, yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Then Councillor Farr, if you could take the chair again, and through you, if I could. Mike, I certainly think that from a transparency perspective, using or exposing the fact that, we're under budgeting in an area, I think is important to note, and correcting that, especially with 5-year trending numbers, is very important. I'm curious to know whether we're doing the same kind of activity, looking for savings where there may be budgets that weren't used over a 5-year period in this or other parts of the organization where we would achieve savings along the same lines.
So through you, through the chair, we are in part some of our driving factors that mitigated some of our pressures going into 2019 related to that within Public Works. I don't have the comprehensive list, but we did look at some of the waste contracts and some of those. I expect before we finish this budget process, we'll look at fuel, given where fuel prices are today versus what we budget. So again, we would look in that area as well. So we have looked at that. We can provide some examples maybe of where we have adjusted the budget, where actuals have been, where budget has exceeded actuals and where we've right-sized the budget to exceed. So we can provide examples of that. A few come to mind within Public Works as part of the 2019 budget.
Yeah, and I think thank you for that, and through you, Mr. Chairman, I think they were all listed in one line, and it was $1 million plus, and I don't think there was a good description that summarized those savings. So I would be interested to see those just as an example, because I think in fairness, you've been fairly specific and detailed here to go one way, and conversely, I think if we're doing that to find savings, I think it's important to note just from a transparency and budget perspective. So.
And through the chair, just process-wise, we reflect savings as we develop the preliminary budget, but where we are increasing the budget, it requires us coming to council to get approval.
Understood. Thanks. I'll take the chair back then, and I'll go to Councillor Whitehead.
I think it's just, it may have been asked, I'm very familiar with the arbitration processes, so I'm trying to understand so this is going to be a permanent annualized expense. So is that a reflection of the amount of arbitrations we have outstanding, or is that a projection of arbitrations we expect in the next number of years? I'm just trying to understand, when you look at justifications, again, peaks and valleys, is this a permanent position, or is this dealing with the peak?
The mic went off there as you pushed it. Yeah, there you go.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So this relates to costs that have historically been spent in a budget that was underfunded. So we know over the period of time that these costs have been consistently higher than the amount that's been budgeted. The issue that we're confronted with now is a combination of an historically underfunded account that's exacerbated by an increase in litigation, not necessarily just in terms of arbitrations, but an increase in cases that we have to defend in terms of WSIB and LTD denials. So there's an increase in WSIB activity, there's an increase in LTD activity, there's an increase in STD activity, that all of which we need to defend, and so the external counsel is hired for those particular issues.
So is there any other arbitrations that are included in this cost other than the ones you just identified?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the arbitrations that are ongoing, there's peaks and valleys in any given year. It's very unpredictable. So for instance, the roads issue that happened a number of years ago certainly increased the amount that was necessary in terms of arbitrations and the legal fees associated with them. Every year there could be a new issue that arises that is going to make that line unpredictable, but what we can speak to with some predictability is that every year since 2009, the account has been underfunded in terms of the amount that we spend.
We're entering into we have entered into multi-year budgeting, and like snow removal and other things, we take a look at those peaks and valleys, we average out the costing, because you can have a good winter, a bad winter. I mean, arbitration is not much different. So help me understand are we, is there some science to this? Are we averaging out a 5-year arbitration expense so that we can create a sustainable budget to deal with those issues moving forward?
To be fair, I think the question was answered while you were out of the room, and that was every year since 2009.
I heard that.
Okay.
But I'm asking, I'm talking about averages now.
I think they've answered.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, yes. The shorter answer is yes. If I look at the 5-year actual experience, it's ranged from 509,000, which was just greater than budget, but each and every year after that, it's far exceeded budget, ranging from 130,000 up to 700,000, 750,000 over budget. So again, it is a 5-year, based on the 5-year, 2013 to 2017 actuals.
Councillor Clark.
I just wanted to thank them for bringing this forward. It's prudent fiscal management. We understand there's ebbs and flows, but at the end of the day, we have to make sure that there's money in the pot to actually pay these things. And I think this is a reasonable amount based on the 5-year average, so thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. I have no further speakers on this one. I need a mover then and a seconder. Moved by Pearson, seconded by Clark. All those in favor, and that's an electronic vote. And that again is BC 11. Thank you, Madam Clerk. And then on to BC 12. Mike, you want to start us off with that one?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll ask Gord to take us through BC 12.
So this is a request for temporary funding. They'll be funded jointly through 50% through the Benefits Reserve Fund and 50% through the WSIB Reserve Fund. It relates to an ongoing issue in Return to Work Services, which is the group that handles all of the claim forms that come in for those that are calling in sick, those who go through the LTD process, those who go through the WSIB process. So in 2017 and 18, we've had a large exodus. We had about 146 years of service in that division leave us. We've been struggling to keep our heads above water, training staff to do very complicated things that are related to the absence management program. And so in this particular case, we require someone over the next 18 months to 2 years to help us get the organization in a good place. We're going through a services alignment. We're going to be hiring a consultant through RFP process in the next couple of months to deal with looking at the whole provision of services that we do in Return to Work Services in order to understand what efficiencies we can make and where our challenges lie. So this division deals with $40 to $50 million worth of claims that come through, whether it's STD, LTD, or WSIB. It's very important that we have an appropriate amount of staff to deal with the influx of all of the cases. In addition to that, as I've already mentioned previously, there's an increase in claims related to mental health, WSIB, PTSD, and all of those are creating extra pressure on the staff in order to accomplish what they are needed to accomplish. So this request is a temporary full-time position that will be for a period of 18 months approximately.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, just to explain why it's before you, it's not the FDE request because again, it's temporary, less than 2 years. The funding source is reserves and only council can approve funding from reserves. So the funding sources are the WSIB and long-term disability reserves, both of which have sufficient funding to sustain this cost for the next 18 months.
Thank you very much. So I have Councillors Ferguson and Whitehead. Councillor Ferguson.
I think Mike answered one of my questions is why isn't net, or the impact on the levy is zero rather than net zero because it's funding from a reserve fund. And if council approves it, then the impact on the levy will be zero then, won't it?
through the chair, yes, and it's important to note, this isn't a permanent request. This is a temporary position.
Year and a half, I heard him say.
Yeah, so we aren't asking to increase the budget permanently. It's just to offset those costs over the 18 months from the reserves. And I'll just add to what Gord has already described. We are looking at roles and responsibilities and some synergies across divisions and sections to see if we can positively affect the workload in this area as well.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, this is something I would approve even if it was impact on the levy, because for almost a year now, we've had 18% absenteeism at HSR, and we haven't been able to move that. And so we need this back to work. We got 14% of police, and I know Gord doesn't do police, but Anna Police does, and whatever, you learn with each other, fix this problem, because every time there's a problem with absenteeism, and this year it's police and transit, they always show up here to add more money, to add more people. And so this is one I fully support adding to try to fix that problem, because I'm worried it's going to be contagious. Other departments, staff are going to see that transit and police are getting away with this, and they're going to say, me too. And so we need to put big focus on it, so I fully support this.
Glad you support it, because I'm coming back to you as a mover. Councillor Whitehead, you're next on my list.
You said that last time. Thank you. I actually support it, but I'm not absolutely clear whether we're effectively using the resources we have and whether we have the appropriate software. I know that in the private sector, there's HR applications now that streamlines a lot of these processes in regards to claims and all those kinds of things that actually are resulting, I know even my wife's company, where they're actually laying people off in these divisions because they're getting such positive results. There's less inputting and less work being done. So I'm going to put that on the radar. I don't expect you to answer that now, but I do want to follow up to whether or not we are using the current resources effectively. Thank you.
Okay, I have no further speakers on this one. Moved by Ferguson, seconded by Whitehead on BC 12. Electronic vote on this one, please. Carries, thank you. Gord, thanks for your help. So as you know, committee members, we did bump up those two positions there. So we'll go back to, I think it was the top of the page, 7. Yep. I'll just wait for that list to come back up on the screen. No problem. Thank you very much. Who's taking us through this one? John, this one yours as well?
Yes, thank you. And through the chair, this is a good example of what we were speaking of earlier, where based on a report that committee and council approved in February of 2017, which in a number of different areas supported the idea of centralizing functions. So in that report, as I recall, excuse me, there was centralizing the communications officers, I think IT was in that same one, and quote, marketing. So what we've been able to do is to secure funding from the operating departments to support the additional position. And a little background on the position. So originally this small team of graphic designers were within PED only. And now with quote centralization, we are offering the services across the corporation and funding it through the monies that are being transferred into our group. We're extremely fortunate that we have a truly creative person on staff right now on contract, and we have another one of our graphic designers coming back from maternity leave fairly soon. So we're going to have a nice say complementary staffing complement if the FTE is approved by committee.
Thanks, John. I have Councillors Whitehead and Jackson on my list. Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you. And again, I have to refer to it because my brother owns a software company, a fairly significant one in Toronto, and they do software development, graphics, the whole bit. Mm-hmm. They did business cases on the best approach, especially on the graphic designer side. And they elected to contract out because there was a cost benefit to doing so. So now we're in the public sector, and I don't know if we've done that assessment in because there's abundance of companies and that do specific, this type of work on contract. You're not paying benefits, you're not paying all those other costs that are associated with full-time staff, and you're only paying for the work that you need at the time that you need it. So have we done the cost-benefit analysis?
Through the chair, and that's a great question. Yes, we have, and what we're finding is that as we've gone from, I'll say, supporting one department to supporting more broadly the city, the consistent demand for services far exceeds our capability to deliver. So people are on their own, certainly going out and outsourcing to different local contractors. So one of the, I'll say, complementary projects that we have underway, because we're not looking to obviously continue to grow and grow and grow this, trying to maximize and optimize the staffing we have. Because just to add in, of course, everything now has to be designed in such a way that it can be used for all mediums. We have the draft started, or the process started with procurement to also build a roster that would be based on very, very specific skill sets, so that we can, I'll say, more or less cap the size of our own staff now, and then refer for those peaks and valleys or unique specializations to a roster through the RFP process that would allow us to, I'll say, steer or guide and coach our operating departments to go to those particular local firms or services they need beyond our capacity to provide them.
Okay, so there's a cost-benefit analysis report I can see? Through the chair.
If I could, through the chair, I'd say probably the sophistication of what you're asking, we don't have that report. What we do have is a very detailed tracking of our volumes within the organization and all of the projects associated with it. And we're able to absolutely summarize that for the councillor to show the volume of work, the cost of the work, and where we're adding in additional business at what we feel is a much lower cost to the corporation than if the operating departments continue to outsource for some of those projects.
Fair enough. And in fairness to the private sector, a lot of the outsourcing is going to India and is done very quickly coming back. So if you're doing a procurement, I think ours stays local and doesn't go outside the city. Is that correct when we do this?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Thank you.
Jackson.
Director, I'm always intrigued when one senior management person says the funding has flowed from other departments, and yet I don't usually see the funding reduced in those other departments to help the funding of this position that's moved over to your division. So should I be looking for something in other corporate financials, public works, planning and ECDEV, community services, where they would all say during the next month or two, Councillor Jackson, remember that one that Director Hertel told you about, that graphic designer that he's so capably covering now? We gave up 15 grand for it towards the $68,000 cost. Director, can you help raise my comfort level on this, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you?
Through the chair, yes. So with the approval of this FTE and the process, we would be happy to share with the councillor the transfer of funds from the departments in question.
That's terrific, John. Thank you. I look forward to that. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. I have no further speakers on this one then. A mover and a seconder. Moved by Whitehead, seconded by Councillor Nan. Thank you. All those in favor, and it's an electronic vote. Okay. Next on the list. John, this one yours as well, the next one?
Yes, thank you. And through the chair, this is a follow-up, I'll say a follow-up item to something we, I'll say, piloted in 2018, which was our first ever citizen survey. When we did the survey, you may recall the presentation, we did it on a basis of it had to be statistically valid. So therefore, it's about finding the right mix of outbound calls. And so we developed, through staff, we developed the survey, all of the reporting, et cetera, in-house. And then we outsourced to, the only part we outsourced was to a company to actually place those calls. The feedback we got on the survey was very positive in terms of both, I'll say, at the highest level, having the survey where we had great information provided by citizens on how they thought we were doing in a wide variety of different categories. The downfall or downside of that particular survey was that it was done, say, on a bit of a shoestring, so it was only valid statistically at a citywide level. And we couldn't provide with any reasonable probability the results at a ward level. So the proposal in front of you is to essentially create a similar survey process. It would be executed every other year, and it would be done with volumes that would allow us to produce ward-specific feedback from the questions that are being asked. There were, I'm going to guess here a little bit, there were about 22 or 23 services that we were inquiring. So we'd go back and make sure we were, I'll say, designing it to, now that we've learned through the initial one, and proceed then. And the way that the monies are suggested here is that we would, first of all, we would go out to through an RFP, because we think obviously there's some competitive advantage in doing that. And we would do it, because we would do it every other year, we would take the equal amount of money, once we understand what that firm number is through the RFP, and spread it out each year. So we would put half, if you will, in the tax stabilization reserve in the year where we were not actually doing the survey. So that will allow us, in terms of what it would mean to each ward, if the number that we're putting here as an estimate at $130,000, that would work out to approximately $8,700 per ward to have that level of detail if committee so desires.
I have no questions on this one. I would need a mover and a seconder to include it. If not, we are on 8, yes. If not, I'll move on to the next one. Councillor Jackson.
Were you in the middle of a vote? I apologize. Were we in the middle?
We technically have no vote because I didn't have a mover and a seconder,
Oh,
so
okay.
I will move on then to number 9.
Okay, thank you.
Converting contractual positions to permanent. You can?
John was very, very helpful in outlining BC08, so maybe we could formally just refer and ask John to bring back possible options and alternatives.
Okay, if we can give
Through
that
you to
direction.
John, direction is fine? Is John okay with that?
And we would move to defer then that position in light of that. You need a formal motion, or it just happens as a result of not dealing with it, Madam Clerk? Okay, move to defer Farr, seconded by Jackson, with John to report back on options and alternatives to that funding.
Happy to do that.
Converting contractual positions to permanent. John, am I back to you again?
Sorry to be dominating the microphone here.
It's all right. We like the sound of your voice.
Thank you, through the chair. So this is specifically within the revenue generation little team. So as you recall, it is a self-funding team. And this represents 2 people. So one full-time person who's been on contract with us, has been a tremendous resource. We would hate to lose that person. And I'm looking to, not for funding, but for conversion to an FTE. The .4, I'll share with you, is an unusual case where when we were previously looking for, we had .6 funding for assistance on the grants program to work with Rosanna, et cetera. We had that funding, and we had some applications. They came in from full-time employees that we thought, well, they didn't read it carefully on the posting, so we called them all back, and one person said, yes, I know, and they happened to be in Tom Hunter's organization, so well, why would you do this? You're already a full-time employee. He said, because I think it'd be a great career move, and so does Tom Hunter. So anyway, he's been with us for a couple of years now as a .6 person. We've expanded his role to also participate and support in the RevGen team. In fact, he was the individual who got our sponsorship funding for the Steel Summit. So he's just been a tremendous asset. You will have seen him in here for City Enrichment Fund, Tamim is his name, and we're looking again. Oh, I'm being told, don't do that. Sorry, Steph. But we're looking for conversion. Again, no funds requested, just the conversion of the FTE to full-time.
Non-funding request, and it is a process-related change to the budget related to the position. Councillors Whitehead and Jackson. Councillor Whitehead.
Certainly the explanation, no impact on the levy, but I'm trying to understand implications down the road. So if this is now legislated position within the purview of the city, and the revenue streams dries up or whatever, we have now locked ourselves into this position.
Through the chair, I guess my response would be on any kind of what I would call a variable position, which the revenue generation team is. Much like the, I'll say the review that Gord provided in terms of building some historical evidence, we have I guess since 2015 now, we have a pattern we know of funds that are already pre-booked. But I would always approach it on the basis if the funds and the work isn't there, then the position would disappear.
So would it be helpful if we actually throw that the condition that this as long as this can be continue to be funded in the manner that you've described, the position's in place, therefore it's already clear for future councils?
Absolutely, I'd be very happy with, and comfortable with that through the chair.
Thank you.
Councillor Jackson.
That was going to be my request, what Councillor Whitehead requested. And John, what's your if this is approved, what would be the complement now in the revenue generation area? And by the way, in the last few years since you've been at the helm, I'll call this the new part of corporate services. I think you've done an incredible job in raising revenue for the corporation from all sectors, public, private, to help offset levy costs and still see projects, programs, services moving forward. So, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you to John, just give me a handle on what your complement would be if approved.
Through the chair, the total complement would be 2.4 people.
So currently you have one. This 1.4 makes it 2.4.
That's exactly the other. The 0.4 is currently.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, I can't hear a single word from what John's trying to tell me.
Library voices on this side of the table, please.
Through the chair, the 0.4 is a contractual component of that individual's work, and the 1.0 is a contract position as well.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, for maintaining quorum, decorum.
Pointing out to the unruly nature of those people on the other side of the table. So, Councillor Whitehead, do you have another question? Turn your mic on.
Councillor Jackson indicated he was going to ask the question. I'm going to ask the clerk if we need to formalize that, or it's just understood it's built in.
When you approve it, I'm going to put the wording in as long as it continues to be funded in the same manner.
Thank you.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, similar to the planning and economic development, you could move direction to report back through the variance report as it relates to actual year performance relative to budget.
Moved by Partridge, seconded by Whitehead. On the position with that direction? Positions, sorry, with an S. Okay, next on the list, government relations and civic engagement.
Do you want me to start this one off, Mike?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, even though John's voice may be better appreciated today, I'll start this one. Is similar to the HR one. I think it's important to bring to council's attention. We undertake work in the past that we don't budget for. So as I think back to the Hamilton Summit and the Steel Summit, while those initiatives had a cost of $35,000, they were supported by a seconded FTE from Audit Services, Bridget Menard. Bridget's now gone back to Audit Services, and there's no FTE to support this work. And the request before you is not for an FTE, but recognizing the fact that from time to time we undertake the work, and recognizing I expect that work will not go away. I'll just remind committee the Hamilton Summit was a prelude to the provincial budget where we set priorities, and we used that forum to communicate to the provincial government what the city's priorities are. With respect to the Steel Summit, it was in relation to the tariffs on steel and aluminum. And again, that effort required coordination and work, and that position no longer exists as a seconded position in the city manager's office. Beyond those efforts, there is from time to time a requirement to find expertise and leverage that expertise to guide us through changes, whether they are changes in provincial policy or changes at the federal policy. We, from time to time, leverage external expertise, and currently there is no funding within the city manager's office budget or departmental budgets for that expertise. A reminder, back in, I believe, 2017, in order to achieve council's directive as it relates to the tax increase, the city manager's office eliminated an intergovernmental relations officer. So there was a position, that position was eliminated. The work continued, but there was no dedicated FTE. So what's before you is a recognition that that work, I expect, will continue. The $200,000 is a placeholder. We don't know what that work will amount to from year to year. But again, it's work that I would suggest will continue. I expect leading into a federal budget, there will be some expectation from council to set some local priorities and communicate those priorities up to the federal level, and subject to what the result of the provincial budget in the end of March is, there could be some impacts on municipalities that we will have to react to and try to better understand. And sometimes that requires accessing external expertise to understand, and as well to communicate what the impact is. I'll provide a more recent example. Is under the changes to the tuition and ancillary fees, one of the proposed changes was to the UPass. That was an initial change that the provincial government wanted to make through CUDA, is municipalities banded together to better communicate what impact that change would have to municipalities. And I believe for HSR it was approximately $7 million out of $41 million in total. Not suggesting all $7 million would evaporate, but a portion of that would. So as I believe last Friday, the province amended that proposed change. So that's the nature of the work that I'm just highlighting needs to be supported, and sometimes that expertise does not reside inside. Sometimes we have to go outside. And again, it's a placeholder there, highlighting the fact that that work, I expect, again, will continue going forward, and it just needs to be funded and recognized.
Thanks, Mike. And I had this one circled earlier, and I do have a speaker's list. And I'll ask Councillor Fard just to take the chair and have a couple quick questions. And without getting into specific names, I was very much a fan of moving people through the city manager's office and other parts of the organization in terms of the seconded scenario that you referenced earlier, in terms of pulling someone from a division or a department into the office to assist with special requirements of whatever files you're working on. You mentioned pulling someone from audit earlier into the office who was there for a period of time. I referenced earlier in the budget process the success of the Six Sigma program, where we've had staff who've been, helping different departments and organizations throughout our organization and even externally. So City Housing was the beneficiary of having someone from the city manager's office help us with our rent arrears. And as far as I know, there was no cost to City Housing in terms of bringing that person in to help our staff with a new process. And I don't believe that there was a cost to the city manager's office because that person was already an employee of the area. So I'm wondering, along the lines of knowing that this work needs to be done, and it's kind of peaks and valleys because it's kind of file and issue driven, I think, as you've given some examples. I just wonder whether there's an opportunity quite similar to the Six Sigma, where we're pulling people maybe on a temporary basis, where there's capacity within departments and from senior leadership team lower down to assist with these kinds of initiatives, much like we've already done to date, so as there's no budget pressure for us. And I think just from a training and succession planning perspective, it exposes some of our best and our brightest to maybe some files that they wouldn't be accustomed to dealing with in their own area of expertise. So sorry for the preamble and the long question, but that would be my question at this point in time, Mike, along the lines of continuing what we've already done, which has been a success.
So through the chair, I think the qualifier is, and the councillor chose the appropriate word, is where there is capacity. So in the case of audit, I suspect just based on most recent experience, and Bridget was a wonderful resource to the city manager's office and to council as well as it relates to those initiatives. But I suspect Charles would tell you it affected his work plan and his ability to deliver on his work plan. So in terms of those summits or events, it would be subject to finding a resource that has capacity, and that in part represents the challenge. Is if you're not backfilling a position, you're effectively identifying where there's gapping or some capacity. And beyond just the internal, what I wanted to highlight is from time to time we're having to leverage external expertise as it relates to helping us navigate through provincial or federal issues. So part of the 200,000 is also reflects the fact that from time to time there are consulting costs to help us in terms of how do we formulate a position with the provincial federal government. I'm not suggesting those are significant to date, but I expect that will continue once we receive the impact of the provincial budget and leading into the federal election. So again, we could look at secondments. I suspect it may create a pressure in the department that individual is coming out of that could require some backfilling. And then over and above that is with respect to external expertise, I expect we'll have to continue to engage external experts to help us navigate through issues. And I'm just highlighting the fact that that isn't budgeted for as well.
Okay, those are my questions at this point in time. I'll take the chair back. I have Councillor Clark next.
Thank you. So, from my experience in the last 4 years anyways, the most successful municipalities dealing with the province of Ontario had external government relations people dealing with specific files, not being contracted as they're here for our beck and call, but for example, land ambulance CAC. We want to secure the rights for that dispatch. There's a process that you have to go through. And our government relations committee, while our councillors and the mayor are very adept at dealing with senior politicians, what I have found is that it's the work of the GR person dealing with the senior policy advisors to the minister, the senior policy advisors to the premier that actually puts the work in front of the decision makers and helps it move forward. The ministers are constantly being called by politicians from every municipality and asking them to deal with situations, and it's been my experience again, we get stock letters back from them saying, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention, we're going to be doing this, and then they talk about their budget or they talk about this, and we're putting Ontario first. I'm paraphrasing, and I don't mean to be disparaging, but that's generally what happens, their stock letter responses. So I'm fully supportive of this type of government relations process going forward, under the guise that, under the proviso, that the projects that we're going to be considering hiring outside GR firms for actually comes to the governance committee for some discussion or with council itself. And we don't want to lay out our strategic plan in public because that's not necessarily the most beneficial. We want to create a strategy privately, but we understand we're going to be concentrating on this area or that area. And there's a number of them that are coming forward. So with respect to where we were, and I recall in my last term of council, I opposed GR governance people. I argued we're elected as politicians, we should be doing this work. What I've seen from actually working in the industry is that there's only so far you can move the envelope with the politicians because they're getting swamped by requests. The politician hands over the documents, the requests from the city to the ministry staff and hands it over to their senior policy advisor. And they start to work on the project, and having a GR person on the inside representing us to help with the drafting of those policies and indicate where the policies need change is incredibly beneficial. So I just want to put it out there, I am supportive of this, but I really think that we need to have it come through the Government Relations Committee so that we're identifying specific areas and priorities and have council say, okay, this is going to be the priority that we're going to be addressing in the coming days. The other thing that happens from it is that those GR people actually develop relationships with people where they start to get advance information coming back to the municipality that there might be a policy change coming, get prepared. And that's not usually handed out to all municipalities. So if you don't have that relationship, it doesn't happen. So I'm fully supportive of this, just with those small caveats, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Thank you.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if I could just in terms of what the councillor has described, that is the model that staff are proposing. I'll give committee some examples where we've actually applied that model to date. Back in August, when the mayor and I had the opportunity to meet with the premier, we went into the meeting highlighting council's priorities, a series of council's priorities where there are some opportunities for efficiencies, as well as where the city has been an example of best practice. So whether the priority was on ambulance paramedic dispatching, that was one of our messages, as well as some of our successes within healthy and safe communities. So that was a very fruitful engagement with our GR expert in order that we came out of that meeting with a common message that otherwise might not have been delivered had we not leveraged that expertise. And I'll ask Paul if he can provide some examples as a province is going through social service reform where there are opportunities to leverage that expertise as it relates to Hamilton's priorities and Hamilton's experience around service delivery.
Through the Deputy Mayor, just as you suggested, Councillor, we took a specific approach around the social assistance reform, the 100-day review. This was a period where we were between councils. We went ahead and engaged some of this work to do exactly what you asked. I had some questions that I wanted to understand how I could best put to the Minister's office. Obviously, the 100 days was a very quick turnaround. It actually did help inform in terms of what my concern was for our budget moving forward, because we were trying to build our municipal budget, and it's a big part of it. And also got some very good responses back in terms of what we're doing in Hamilton, and made a connection so that we can continue to move it forward. So just as you've described, not a call up every day, try and dream up things, but where we have specifics. And then the one that you're very interested in and we want to work on, I can see we will need this support around paramedics. Although we've asked before, although we've done this before, working with someone, and there's some specific things we're going to have to do if we want to be successful. Otherwise, we'll continue to ask for the same thing and we're going to continue to get the same response. So I just want to speak positively of this as a way, and at the senior leadership team, we're all in support of bringing this forward because we do feel there needs to be some checking in so that we do have the priorities set, but we all identify that from time to time we need this kind of support.
Thanks for the editorial comment. So when we're dealing with paramedics specifically, for example, and the previous government passed a bill, and the bill is now sitting there. It went through third reading, but it has not been proclaimed into law. And it's a perfect example of a bill where you would need outside external GR, because the bill was written by a Liberal government. It's currently a progressive Conservative government, and so you need someone who's actually going to be able to help us draft communications and deal with the senior policy advisors with a lens of sensitivity that there is a partisan environment at Queen's Park again. And so that bill actually dealt with some great things. It may never get proclaimed into law, but we could certainly help the government move in a certain direction to draft their own bill that they can take partisan credit for, but actually does move forward and help us with that issue. So that's another example in my mind where that external GR person would be very helpful. It's a specialty. It's not something that everyone around the table has. And the relationships that we're developing are really important. So I thank the staff for considering it and bringing it forward. I fully support it. I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Danko.
Thank you, and through the chair, I think Councillor Clark touched on a lot of what I was going to mention, so thank you for that. I think some of the recent back and forth with the upper levels of government over legislation, I think really highlights how important having external government relations professionals are. So I'm ecstatic to see this on the budget, because it really does come down to those personal relationships, which is something that behind the scenes is so important. So I see this as an investment where we are looking to build and reinforce those personal relationships to further the city of Hamilton's interests, and I expect for there to be a return on this investment by having that a constructive relationship with the upper levels of government. So I'll certainly be supporting it as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Wilson?
Thank you very much. Yep, absolutely. This is a no-brainer. This is an investment. This is the long game. It's all about relationships. The deliverables may not be so obvious, but it's getting the professionals in there early, hopefully to try and limit the reactive nature of what we're having to do. But I very strongly support this. Thank you.
Councillor Nat.
No comments on the GR end of this item. I'm just curious on the other end, the civic engagement component. Mike, or through the chair, if staff could just speak a little bit to that component of the work.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I made reference in 2018, specifically it was the 2 summits that were supported through the city manager's office, and as I mentioned, it was through a secondment. We no longer have that resource. We can continue to look at. I agree with the previous councillor's comments. I too like the secondment model. It really allows staff an opportunity to get exposure to what I'll describe as corporate work, and work that allows them to engage with the broader community as well as some stakeholders within the community. From time to time, though, that impacts on other service areas. So where a position is necessary to deliver a business plan and a work plan, it sometimes requires backfilling. So again, we can take that away in terms of how to further evolve our opportunities for staff to develop, and through secondments or assignments. I just wanted to highlight that that work currently isn't properly resourced within the budget, and I fully expect that work is going to continue, especially as we go into the fall of 2019 leading into it. I would not be surprised if we have a conversation in spring and summer around setting some local priorities going into the federal election.
Okay, thank you.
I have no further speakers on this one here, which was number BC 10. Mover and a seconder on that one. Moved by Pauls, seconded by Danko. All those in favor? Electronic vote required. Okay, now going on to the next one, which is, oh, we did 11 and 12 because we bumped them up early. Perfect. I need a motion then to move the receipt of the presentation. Moved by Farr, seconded by Nan. All those in favor, carries. And I need a motion to adjourn. Moved by Clark, seconded by Pearson. All those in favor, carries. Thank you.